listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across America and the increasingly divided surface of our world. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. It is September 21st. It's 7 a.m. Eastern, and it's time for headlines. First up, in COVID news, there are about 208,000 new COVID cases reported in the United States. As of yesterday, there were also 2,252 deaths reported. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 137,295 cases per day. That's an increase from 4% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 55% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 64% of residents have received at least one dose. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 42,274,000 people across the United States. In total, it has also killed 676,191 people here in the U.S. In national news, the White House stated yesterday that they will be lifting blanket travel restrictions to visitors as long as they can prove their vaccination status. Only fully vaxxed individuals will be able to tour and visit the U.S. These new rules will take effect in early November. I heard that they were going to be targeting Europe specifically, travelers from Europe. A Yahoo News and YouGov poll shows that a majority of people in the United States are in favor of the Roe v. Wade ruling. In the question of overturning the ruling, 55% were against this move. Only 29% said they were in favor of unrestricted abortion access, and the vast majority believe there should be some laws implemented to restrict the process. Speaking of abortion laws, a Texas doctor is being sued for performing an abortion past the 6-week restriction that's outside of the permitted window under the new and controversial Texas law. Dr. Alan Braid became the first doctor to publicly violate the law and is being sued by an Arkansas man, quote, to test the constitutionality of the law, end quote. That's a remarkably transparent motive for doing the guy. But hey, there you go. As the Biden administration deals with more than 15,000 migrants on the Texas border, new guidelines have come out saying they will prioritize single adult migrants. Some unaccompanied children and families will be allowed to stay in the U.S. for a temporary time before being deported, but many will be forcibly sent back to Haiti. All migrants, regardless of age or marital status, will be deported if they have not declared asylum status. And as these things are wont to do, Jamarl, we might come back on this, but have you seen the video of like the Texas Border Patrol on horseback with like whips?
I've seen that, whipping the,
Yeah.
That's unfortunate, yeah.
It is unfortunate, and it's not just bad optics, it's a bad situation. Yeah. But it is also bad optics. In international news, the UN General Assembly begins in earnest today after a musical appearance by the K-pop band BTS last night. No, I'm not kidding. Almost 1 million viewers tuned into the event, flooding the chat with purple heart emojis. Again, that's setting up the UN General Assembly, which will be going on throughout the week. President Biden will speak there today during his debut appearance at the meeting. This follows an extremely rocky 6 past weeks. On Wednesday, Biden also plans to present an international COVID-19 response plan. On Friday, Pacific leaders will meet. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled that Russia is responsible for the 2016 killing of Alexander Litvinenko. The former Russian intel agent turned whistleblower/defector was killed by radiation poisoning linked to a cup of green tea. 2 Russian agents were found to be responsible. On the Russian side, there are still questions about the involvement of Mario Scaramella. It's a story that I looked into like a while back, year and a half ago, something like that. But, I knew more about it. I've forgotten more than, I want to get back into it at some point, especially with the passage of this new ruling. Mm-hmm. An interesting story. Did you ever look into that one, Jamarl? Litvinenko thing?
I didn't see this particular one, no.
This is like the first big, as far as I know, but I can say it pretty confidently, the first big Russian poisoning accusation. There are the Skripals
right
in the UK. There's also his name escapes me right now for some reason, but there's the associate of Browder, who was also, it's opinions vary basically whether he was poisoned or whether he died of natural causes. Basically, a guy in the UK, he slumped over running. Some people were alleging for a while that he was poisoned by this rare herb.
Yeah.
Other people were alleging that, if I remember correctly, he just basically had heart problems. But basically, the Litvinenko case set this up. And so I want to be getting into this sometime later in the week.
Okay.
In Sudan, 40 officers have been arrested today after a failed military coup d'etat attempt. The officers were arrested after attempting to take over the state broadcaster's television buildings and the military general command. In tech news, the trial of the fraudulent tech founder Elizabeth Holmes is ongoing. This week, scientists are who were formerly working for Theranos, the company she founded, are alleging that Holmes intimidated them into covering up evidence suggesting that the blood analysis technology she was developing and selling didn't actually work. Holmes is on trial for fraud. In business news, Samuel Adams is launching a new limited edition beer. The Utopias brand contains 28% alcohol by volume. That makes it illegal in 15 states. Only 13,000 bottles will be made, and the estimated price is $240 for a 25.4 ounce bottle. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. A 28% alcohol by volume beer.
I don't know the legalities around that. I would imagine there's a max amount for beer, max amount to be considered alcohol, beer, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. What's the one for beer? What's the max?
Well, it seems to vary by state, definitely.
Yeah.
With different states, allowing this. Most states are allowing this, but 15 aren't. I'll put it like this. The beers that I've been like, oh, that's a strong beer. Those are like, starts at 8-9%.
Yeah.
The really strong ones are like 12-13%. This is approaching a liquor. This is between like a port and a hard liquor of some type or another,
That's pretty intense.
It is pretty intense.
Why do they need a beer that strong?
For PR. That's what it is, right? I mean, only 13,000 bottles and $240 per bottle means that if they can get people to
buy it,
cash in on the novelty of it, then that's going to be good for them.
That's wild. I mean, that's pretty strong beer. I mean, do people love the taste of beer that much where they're like, I really want to get totally wasted, but I really love that taste of beer, and this is the drink that I'm going to do for that?
Well, it could be that comes to mind, but also literally the exact opposite, where they're like, I really hate the taste of beer, but I love getting drunk, and so I just want to have a little sip of beer and get toasted. You know what I mean?
They get alcohol at that point, like when you get like
I hear
tequila or something like that. It just seems like working very hard to get the beer taste and the heavy whiskey alcohol intoxication immediately after.
Yep.
I was never a beer drinker. I never was into it. My uncles used to sit there and drink for hours, like beer after beer after beer, like going through a case. And it's like, how are you guys doing that? But at that point, they had been doing it for so long. I remember they used to, when we were much, much younger, hasn't happened a while ago, but they would black out, like get so wasted that the next day they're like, I have no idea what happened that day.
Oh, yeah.
It's like they were at a party or something.
That's not a good way to be, in my opinion.
No, it's not a good way to be. My mom's boyfriend, well, they're married now, but at the time, this was like 20, 30 years ago, he was hanging out with them. It's like, oh, I'm going to be drinking with her brothers and everything else. They drunk him under a table, to put it mildly. Again, they drink like this. They used to drink like this all the time. And so he's like taking shots of beer, going after the next. And after a while, he's just out of it. And they're still throwing it back.
That's not good. Yeah, I know people growing up who were like that. And I'll be honest, they were drinking when they were underage. And maybe it was the time and place, but a lot of them got into worse stuff. I'm not saying slippery slope is everything, but a lot of them started getting blackout drunk. And then within a year, were addicted to heroin. Yeah. And I was no longer friends with them.
Jeez.
But it was that level. Me personally, I like a good beer. I bought some whiskey the other night. But on the other hand, I've been like, should I just stop drinking this stuff entirely? It lowers your T, man. It lowers your testosterone.
Oh, does it?
It does, fairly consistently. We've got to wrap this one up pretty quickly because, of course, we have our guest on the line, Brian McDonald. We're going to him slightly early. We're going to be talking about the results of the Duma elections in Russia this weekend with Brian. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Living
charge, and I want the court to
Talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. We're joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. But right now, we're going to go for a special segment. Typically, we do the monologue for this segment, but we're going to go into the Russian election to figure out what were the results of the election that took place on Sunday. Joining us is Brian McDonald. He's head of the Russia desk at RT Online, and you can follow him on Twitter at 27KHV. Brian, how's it going, man? Thank you for joining us.
No problem. Good morning to you.
So what took place in regards to the election? What were the results in the election that took place on Sunday?
The result was a win for the pro-Putin United Russia Party. They returned with a super majority, as it's called. Basically, in the Russian election is a little bit different than your own elections in the sense that it's, first of all, it's a multi-party thing.
Right.
So it's more like Germany or Britain, and it's split into two ways of doing it. There's 450 seats, and 225 of them, half of them, are awarded under a proportional representation party list system, and the other half are awarded through a first-past-the-post system. So it's very much a hybrid system. First-past-the-post is the same system you would use in the United States and the same system they would use in the United Kingdom. Although they use it for a parliament, not for a Congress or a House of Representatives. And the proportional representation system is something more similar to what they use in Germany, for example. So the results were that United Russia, the pro-Putin government party, they won 49% of the vote, which was down 5% on 5 years ago. The communists were up 5% to 18%. The far right party, the LDPR, went down by 6% to only 7%. Fair Russia, which is a sort of left-wing party, they had a slight rise to 7% from 6%. And a new grouping, which is called New People, that's a liberal party, but it's a pro-Kremlin liberal party rather than a pro-Western liberal party. They got 5%, and obviously that was their first election. So basically, the systemic liberals and the communists were the big winners. And I suppose the big losers were the far right. And you could say that Putin's party lost support, but it still won the election in terms of seats. So basically, it means that nothing really changes except there'll be a larger communist opposition and a smaller far right opposition. And there's this new liberal party that is a completely unknown quantity. Nobody knows really what to expect from them.
Can you give us, you did briefly last time, but I feel like it's worth going over once more. Russia's political system, for one thing, the fact that the ruling party took 50% of the vote and that the second party was almost 20% of the vote were the communists. On the one hand, for Americans, that I can understand how we might understand that quite readily. On the other hand, there's actually a lot more than just a left-right division here. Can you explain between the communists and all of the other parties, left, right, center, et cetera, who fell behind them? What are the political divides? What do these parties represent? And through that, what did people ultimately vote for in terms of policies when they voted for them, Brian?
Well, much of the vote that went to the communists was a protest vote in the sense that the communists were seen as the most likely party to kind of, wipe the pro-Putin United Russia in the eye. I mean, don't forget that Ed Ross and now Rossiya, the party government, has been in power for 18 years, effectively. A lot of people would like to see them out of office. A lot of people think they've become corrupt and arrogant and, sort of a more like a sort of jobs for the boys thing and girls at this stage than a party with any real policy to change things. So a lot of the communist vote would not be down to the fact that people suddenly decided they want to restore the Soviet Union. It'd be down to the fact that because the communists were the second biggest party the communist candidates were, generally speaking, better placed to punish United Russia. That's why, for example, Alexei Navalny, the Western-backed opposition figure, he came up with this idea called smart voting, and his idea was to encourage his supporters, which are probably about, somewhere between 3 and 5% of the country, to back the candidate he saw, or his people saw, as most likely to defeat the United Russia candidate in individual constituencies. And most of them were communists. I mean, like 60, 70% of the ones that were chosen were communists. So that's important to note. The drop in support for the far-right party, the LDPR, might also be down to the fact that a lot of their vote before was a protest vote. It wasn't because people were fascistic or ultra-nationalist. It was because they thought that voting for the LDPR was a way to kind of, take some seats from United Russia that could be responsible for their fall. And, just about to answer your question, like directly, I'm kind of answering it indirectly. Russian politics is not particularly ideological, to be quite honest with you, except for the fact that there's a core vote of about, 10% to 12% of the electorate that are really, really communist and really would like to see communism restored. There's probably a core 5 to 6, 7%, basically what the LDPR got, that is ultra-nationalist in Russia. There's another 5% that is pro-Western, and they would be the people that would have supported Navalny if he had taken part in the election, if he had a party to take part in the election, he was not in prison. And they're also the people that would have supported Yabloko, which is a small liberal party which got about 1.5% of the vote, I think 1.3%. Yabloko were a more powerful entity back in the 2000s, but as liberalism's star has faded in Russia, so has theirs. Now, the new people I introduced as a liberal party, and I also said they're an unknown quantity, they are auspiciously a liberal grouping, a pragmatic liberal grouping that support the present system, rather than, say, a more revolutionary liberal grouping that would like to see, the current system collapse. And then there's about another 8 or 9 smaller parties who all got about, 1% of the vote or less. There's, for example, the Party of Progress, which got about 2.5%. It's hard to know what to make of them, to be honest with you. I think they're a kind of pro-business party under Boris Titov. There's the Yabloko I mentioned. They actually got 1.34%. There's another communist party called the Communists of Russia, which were originally set up as a kind of breakaway spiler party to the original communists, and they got 1.2%. And then there's Rodina, which is really a fascist party. They got 0.8%. And then there's various other parties I won't bore you with.
What was the main fault line in this particular election? Meaning, what were they basically voting for or against in this election? Was it just, to maintain things as is, or were they trying to instantiate some kind of changes in the country itself in these votes?
Well, see, one of the paradoxes, Jamarl, of Russian politics is that while President Putin himself is popular, I mean, he gets 60 to 70% of the vote, or 60 to 70% in approval ratings, in various polls, his party is not. I mean, while Putin himself is kind of seen as, I wouldn't say above politics, that's a bit extreme, but in some ways he's seen as kind of, above the fray. He's seen as a kind of, at this stage, he's been there so long, he's seen as a kind of father of the nation to some extent. I don't want to go too far with that. I don't be too much hyperbole about that. But he's seen as, in a way, kind of, above the drudgery of day-to-day politics. So while he's popular, his party is obviously not remotely as popular as him. I mean, don't forget that the turnout was only about 50%, 40 to 50%. I don't have the exact figure to hand, sorry. I think it was 45% or 46. So that means that a lot of people did not vote. A lot of people are just apathetic, or thought their vote wouldn't change anything, or just can't be bothered. So in reality, I suppose it means that the pro-Putin party only really got about 25% or 20 to 25% of support if you include all Russians. And, there was polling done before the election that included people that didn't want to vote and people that couldn't decide. And the Putin party was kind of, getting around, 30% in those polls. So while the president himself has a lot of legitimacy, the party that he's most associated with and which he campaigned for does not have the same kind of legitimacy that he has. And every election, their vote goes down. I mean, they were up around 70% at one stage about a decade ago. They fell to 54, 55 in the last election. Now they're below a majority, below 50% on 49. Obviously, the trajectory is downwards. But people are not crying out for a specific alternative either. I mean, if you look at the alternatives, I mean, the communists who were the main opposition party in the 90s and are now, again, the main opposition party, they're on around, 18%, 18 to 19%. The exact figure was 18.93. If you include the other communist party, the smaller one, they'd just be above 20%. So there's no, there's no real, and as I said already, a lot of that vote is a protest vote. So there's no kind of real, basically, I suppose what I would say in an objective sense is that a lot of people are saying, we're tired of this pro-Putin United Russia party. However, we largely support the man himself, and we don't see an alternative at the moment. So what's happened instead is that the vote has splintered amongst loads of smaller parties. Now, I mentioned New People earlier. They're interesting in the sense that they're a systemic liberal party, and there obviously is a 5 to 10% of the Russian electorate is liberal or would see itself as liberal, especially in large cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and secondary cities like Kazan and Krasnodar and Voronezh and Yekaterinburg. And it's interesting to see how they will go, because they could just turn out to be a weak group that don't really do anything, and they're in the next election, they just might disappear, or they could surprise us all and turn out to be kind of robust and they say they're pragmatic. They could turn out to be robust, get some legislation through, perhaps, act as a kind of break on the conservative course that the country's been going down for the last decade. That's just something to watch. And also is to watch how the communists work with the system, because obviously now that the communists are by far the main opposition party, how much rope is the Kremlin going to give them? I mean, already like their most popular ones, I wouldn't say the most popular, but their most favored candidate, Pavel Grudinin, who formerly contested the presidential election, was refused access to the ballot for this election because his ex-wife revealed that he had assets hidden in Belize. But he says that was politically motivated. But how the communists are treated, and how now that the communists have sizable support again, how they fare against the Kremlin will be interesting. Like, will it become a kind of clampdown situation, or will they be given the oxygen that their electorate obviously wants them to get?
Brian, you've just brought in like 1,000 questions that I have immediately after this, but I know you have to go. So I'm going to say thank you for joining us. I know it was short notice. The voice that you guys are listening to is Brian McDonald. He's head of the Russia desk at RT Online. And you can follow Brian on Twitter at 27KHB. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Hi, I'm political analyst Garland Nixon.
And I'm political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist Dr. Wilmer Leon.
We're the co-hosts for The Critical Hour, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C.
We close out your day with a thorough and hard-hitting analysis of the day's top stories, where we bring in brilliant scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time, when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show,
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And we're going to be bringing in Dr. Mikhail Kogan after a while, even though I think we have a few minutes before we bring him in. Great conversation with Brian. I'm fascinated by that. The communist thing, I think they were like about 20% of the electorate. And Brian makes a really good point, or makes a really good question. How much oxygen are they going to get in order to kind of push an agenda? And more importantly, what is that agenda? Like, is this agenda an unraveling of the state of sorts in a way that, the previous communist government was?
I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's what I mean. Like, what's the methodology? What's the thing that they're trying to accomplish in the context of the Communist Party? Or is it purely just an opposition? No, it's just very interesting, especially with all of the different parties and everything else.
I don't know. I'll put it like this. I'll try to present briefly two contrary viewpoints on this. One, the West sees Russia as effectively, the West likes to paint Russia as a one-party state because Russia is dominated by the United Russia Party. I think Ed Ross is the, shortened version of it that he used. Ed Ross from the Russian side, United Russia from our side, whatever. Anyway, that was the nickname. The West likes to paint it as a one-party state, and Putin is effectively an authoritarian. As far as I can tell, I don't know exactly what the Russian side thinks, but from brief contact with people living on the Russian side, it seems like Russia in the after the fall of the Soviet Union, reeling, desperately looking for a center, finds a center in the form of a man, Vladimir Putin, who has, over the course of several decades now, managed to attain and preserve some stability. And Ed Ross, the party that has most closely attached itself to him, and that he admittedly was attached to too, even though he's an independent as far as I know, basically. Yeah. The Russia that's the party that's most closely attached to him has done pretty well, but is starting to do less well, partly because it's not his party so much. Like if I can take Brian at his word, and I think I can because he was actually quite honest there, going over criticisms, far more honest than I'm used to from American coverage of our own elections for certain, for sure. Putin, where I would have gone with him is like, what should Putin create another party? The West would immediately paint that as, okay, that's ridiculous. He's just creating a new one at this point, probably. But it's like the man himself has been able to preserve stability. Right. It's not the party that's preserved stability. There isn't a recognizable
alternative.
Yeah, a recognizable alternative. And so I think he wants to get it out of that. I think he wants, and somebody in the chat was also asking, I think we've had this conversation before last year at one point, is there an obvious heir apparent? Is there an obvious person that Putin has picked to follow on with his legacy, that kind of thing? Last I checked, there wasn't.
I haven't seen one.
Yeah.
I remember when Putin not first got in, but at one point there was Medvedev. I can't remember.
Dmitry Medvedev.
Yeah, right. It was Medvedev.
They swapped around who was actually in charge. Yeah.
Right. But that didn't, that's not necessarily heir apparent. I got to be honest. I don't know. I mean, this feels similar to kind of Merkel and what comes after Merkel. And it's this kind of, question mark. Look, whatever people want to think of him in the West or in the United States, for the most part, he is popular. Brian is right in regards to popularity, and he has been a source of stability in regards to the country. So, yeah, I don't know what that looks like after him. As for creating another party, that's interesting. I'm not quite sure. I mean, like, as Brian was making the point, well, he's popular, but the party is not necessarily popular, and it seems to be degrading in regards to his popularity. There's just a lot of questions that gets raised. Like, why, for example? I mean, it's like, okay, people want to change, but they don't necessarily know what that is or what that looks like. And then trying to find an alternative to something that has been stability for the last nearly 20 years. Well, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do any more than it is in Germany.
But it's arguably, that's the kind of thing that's probably necessary. I mean,
because the person's not going to live forever, right?
The person's not going to live forever, and if there are fundamental problems that person alone can't solve, that you need to solve through legislative politics, then you try to make the legislative changes. But in the same way that the national scene has a leader, you'd need new leaders on the lower level too. I don't know. Again, admittedly, this stuff is outside of our bailiwick, but it's interesting to talk about. And I think folks who listen to the show get a better insight into it than they would on literally any Western media. You could hear Brian. He was critical. He was going back and forth, talking about how people like to portray the Ed Ross party. Anyway, good coverage by him.
Yes.
Good talking with him.
Very interesting. All right, let's do this. Let's take a break, and we're going to come back with Dr. Mikhail Kogan. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories, all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So Joe Biden has been trying to basically go with this idea of a COVID vaccine booster as a way of dealing with numbers that have started to increase once again. I think today or yesterday, there were 2,252 deaths reported. On Friday, I think the number was at 3,000. The day before that, I think it was at 2,500. And so you can imagine that if you're the president of the United States and your job is to basically deal with the issue of COVID, and then I have COVID flail out of control, that number is a problem. And the increasing numbers of hospitalizations, ICU visits, ER visits, etc., is a problem, existential on some level. Biden has gone with the idea of a COVID booster, but Biden is not necessarily getting the full-throated, let's say, support of the COVID booster that he would want. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Dr. Mikhail Kogan. Dr. Mikhail Kogan is medical director at George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, associate professor of medicine at George Washington University, and founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the undeserved. Dr. Mikhail Kogan, thank you for joining us.
Hi, how are you?
We're doing all right. So in a surprise vote, the Food and Drug Administration on Friday recommended against approving the booster dose of Pfizer-BioNTech for people who are 16 years and older. Now, this, of course, is somewhat of a thumb in the eye because this is basically what Biden has been, planning on. I mean, this seems to be the thing that he's hinged everything on. Are they going to still push this through regardless? I mean, and more importantly, why didn't they give him the approval that he wanted on this?
Well, I think it is surprising. I think FDA followed the science and basically said if you are a healthy individual and you are less than 65 years old, you don't need a booster because the prior regimen of 2 vaccines or Johnson Johnson 1 vaccine still appears to be highly protective. And only people who have immune compromise, 65 or older, or have, and there's a gray area there, or have pre-existing condition that increases risk of severity of illness. Now, they didn't really define that very well. So I think there's going to be additional stipulations and a clarification as to exactly who in that category are. So there's speculation that maybe, say, obesity could be considered as one such a condition. But I have not actually seen exact statements. They may also leave it up for a treating physician to say, look, I know my patient well, and I think this patient should be getting a booster. That could make a lot of sense because on paper, there could be one situation. In reality, it could be another. And if you just give, say, a couple of different conditions, you may actually be narrowing the scope too much, and the physician may actually know quite much better whether the risk is high and thus given individual is justified to get a booster.
Dr. Kogan, a general question that I feel is necessary to have when we're talking about this specific one. You as a medical practitioner, you'll read journals, you'll learn in various ways what the higher ups, so to speak, are recommending. Higher ups, I mean in the CDC, the FDA, et cetera. When it comes to our vaccine policy, and I mean America's vaccine policy, but also our attitude towards vaccines as they're distributed around the world, that's where this booster conversation comes in. What is the take right now? What are we going for? Because I'll set it up just briefly like this. There's a substantial portion of the population, a large minority of people here in the States, and I can imagine this holds true, I've seen it in countries in Europe and South America and around the world, who just are not going to get vaccinated. By hook or by crook, they're going to do what they have to do to not get vaccinated, basically. Now, maybe some of them are lying. Maybe they're playing it up for clicks or follows or whatever, but taking them at their word, there are a lot of people who just aren't going to do this, which means that the original herd immunity, community immunity approach is not going to work. And so in some sense, people are getting vaccinated, sure, because they feel it's their social duty to do so, but also because it's a protective. This is why people would be getting boosters here in the States, not just because they're prescribed boosters, but because whether you're old or you're immunocompromised, whatever the case may be, you want to get it so that you're less likely to have the worst effects of COVID. But that's not managing COVID as a whole. COVID, the virus, would still be circulating. It would still be slowly mutating. In other words, this would become a kind of forever disease like the flu. That's been the concern for a long time. But I guess, putting all that out on the table, what sense have you gotten from the quote unquote higher ups about where they want vaccine policy to go and what they're trying to do with it? Dr. Kogan.
Well, I think reading between the lines, so let's put the science aside for a second. I think, let's say that tomorrow everybody of that, say, 40% of adults who are eligible wake up and say, I'm going to go get vaccinated. So if that happens, then we're going to have a shortage, right? I mean, we don't have enough shots for the booster and for additional first, and then in several weeks, a second. So it's possible that there's still a hope that some kind of a shift will occur, that more people will uptake a vaccine. I personally don't think it's going to happen. I think we're probably close to reach maximum vaccinations, because no matter what the message you're going to put out there, there's going to be a substantial proportion of people who are not going to get vaccinated. It's not putting our country well out for the world. I mean, look at some countries like Israel, where you have nearly universal vaccination rate. So, on that contrast, we look pretty weak and concerning. And there's the World Health Organization has raised repeatedly concerns that U.S. is going to continue to be the sort of the pool for the virus to continue to circulate, even in some countries. Eventually, within next months, the circulation of the virus is going to go down very quickly to close to nothing. And I think it's a pressure. I mean, it's a substantial political pressure on Biden administration to say, look, what are you going to do about this? And maybe that assumption was, if we're going to say boosters are fine, there's going to be more people who are going to start taking first shots. I don't know. I actually don't think so. I think that no matter what the messages are going to get put out there, we probably could getting close to the maximum level of vaccination. Now, there is also a point, even if we vaccinate 100% of people, unfortunately, it appears that the virus is going to continue to circulate. Now, it's going to circulate less if we vaccinate more, and probably it's going to mean that the actual pandemic is going to be shorter. But frankly, that's not 100% certain.
And so we're at the point now where basically and look, I think I agree with you. Basically, we're saturated with the number of people who got their vaccine. If they haven't gotten it yet, it's likely that they won't necessarily get it, or at the very least, we're getting to, bare bones difference. You believe that this is just going to be something that just perpetuates itself year after year after year, considering that basically it just keeps going and just mutates continuously, kind of like a cold or like a flu.
But I will tell you that I don't think it's going to be like flu. The flu seems always circulate with seasons. COVID doesn't seem to do that, meaning that we're going to have some low level of continuous infection throughout. There's no expectation that somehow virus is going to mutate to get weaker and then disappear. Generally speaking, infectious diseases don't do that, or viral infections don't do that. The best hope is that gradually people are going to get immune, either with the vaccines, boosters, or they're just going to get sick, and after they get sick, they get immunized, and then they don't get sick again for quite a while. And, when that happens, eventually you're going to have some form of immunity for in everybody. And when that happens, I think the circulation is going to start dramatically decreasing. I think that's the hope. But even with that, chances are that we're going to see some circulation of virus continuing. Will that still be concerning? Meaning, if somebody's already immune to some degree, when they get it second, third, or fourth time, they're probably not going to get a really severe illness. On top of that, vaccines are still effective, and I don't think that somehow suddenly the effectiveness is going to go down to really low levels. Plus, they're going to keep working on developing boosters that are going to cover more strains, are going to be even more effective. So, I mean, I think chances are we're looking at some uncertainty of how it's going to go, but it should go down eventually, and that down should be relatively soon. I have seen predictions anywhere from this fall till this winter. So, we're not looking at 12 months from now. We're still going to have the same level of continuous infection, I think.
What's the reasoning? What are the facts that would suggest that that's going to happen, or that that's likely?
Well, I mean, I think that it's basically is that for now, at least, the vaccine seems to be still quite protective against severe illness. And as I said, more and more people are going to get infected. So eventually, the virus will burn yourself off, so to speak, because there's going to be no more unsick, unvaccinated people to be infecting, because those are the ones that are spreading more. Those are the ones that are potentially getting sicker a lot more.
But what about variants? What about because right now, if I look at the chart where we are in terms of our vaccinated population, admittedly not fully, but over 50% by a pretty wide margin fully.
I think the variants are putting all of this at more an uncertainty. So, if we just say, look, the Delta is the last variant, I think the conversation would have been a little bit more predictable. But I think knowing that there's going to be more mutations and more variants, there's a good chance that we're going to see something else come up that's going to be even worse than Delta. And I think that's the main wrinkle, and that's why I think a lot...
That's a massive wrinkle.
Yeah, I was about to say, that's a little bit more than a wrinkle, Dr. Kogan. I mean, if the individual has a certain protection because they either caught the virus or they basically had the vaccine, well, like as you mentioned before, the Delta variant or whatever the other variants are different. The mutations allow them to basically get around some of the protections that would have typically been there. And so, I mean, it doesn't seem like there is any way to entirely predict whether or not this is going to go to the wayside at all. I mean, in fact, it seems like it's more likely that it's not going to do that, considering we've just had mutations the entire way through.
Right. No, I completely agree. I mean, the hope is that even when the new variants show up, we're still going to have some sense of it, some immunity. I mean, it may not be a full immunity, but, the illness hopefully will not be as severe because we're ready to see virus. Interestingly, the variants of interest, right, so they call, they're quite different, but it seems like so far that there hasn't been anything more infectious than Delta. So is it possible that the new variants, like I think the Mu variant from South America, is it possible that, they're going to keep showing up, but they're not going to be necessarily more infectious? They may bring new symptoms. They may create more challenge in diagnosis and things like that. But, if they're not getting more infectious, then we are not going to see this level of spiking as we're seeing now. At least I think that I'm saying a best case scenario. And this is, I think, where you're absolutely right. I think predicting this is really difficult. And I actually distrust every expert who's saying, I know what's going to happen. They've been saying that before, and look where we're today. So I'm more skeptical of that. I think the uncertainty is very high. I think the uncertainty that we will not even be able to understand what exactly are we're going to be having 2 years from now is very high, because the variability or chances of worst versus best case scenario is probably quite wide. But what I feel strongly is that we will not have sort of the flu-like situation, that we're going to have periods of no virus. I think we're going to have virus all the time. It may just be what we had early in the summer, right, where we had something like 50,000 to 20,000 cases a day, and also, the mortality went down dramatically. Well, maybe we'll have only 1,000 cases a day for the whole country at some point. But, we're not going to see a kind of complete leveling off and elimination of virus for quite a long time. If there's anything I'm certain of, that's what I'm certain of.
And I'll be honest, you're far more honest about your uncertainty on this one than the vast majority of medical professionals talking about this on a high level. As far as I can tell, at least, a lot of people, the messaging that we're getting from the White House, what little of it that we can get, hasn't been, okay, we got this wrong, and this wrong, and here's what we've learned from it. There's been nothing like that as far as I can tell. But maybe I'm not seeing it. Real quick, do you disagree with me there, Dr. Kogan?
No, I'm not. But I'm also like trying to sort of put myself in their shoes and say, how would I behave? It's hard. I mean, pretty much almost all the messages in the past were wrong continuously.
It's true. Well, so here's an interesting thing, and then we have a break that we should get through, and we're going to be coming back talking about booster shots. Shots for kids, specifically, of course, the 5 through 11-year-old testing range. They're saying it seems to be working. I want to talk about that as well. But there's also this issue of panic. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but I read this interesting article the other day that was going over medical panics. The history of government responses to any kind of crisis, but they were specifically looking at various pandemics, epidemics, et cetera. And they were looking at how public officials viewed and feared panic and how those fears were largely unjustified. In other words, you can see this in the White House's response and arguably in the world's response. It makes sense to me. My tendency is to go, okay, if we tell people things are going to be really bad, then they're going to start to freak out. They're going to panic. They're going to go into panic buying mode. It'll devolve into looting. That's hyperbolic, of course, but that's the attitude. And yet, when they looked at the vast majority of epidemics, when there was a medical crisis like this, people actually went into the opposite mode. They got more rational. They acted more altruistically. They, instead of running away from the cities, for instance, they went to the front lines to try to help out. Whether that's a mistake or, a correct move varies in cases. But the point is, a lot of how, going over it, the natural tendency is for governments to fear panic and for that fear to be disproven as the crisis rolls on. The one exception to this was when public officials implemented actions that the public didn't understand, that wasn't explained to them, and that was, completely new, completely novel, which seems to me to broadly apply to what's going on right now, where we've had massive worldwide changes. Now we're getting, I know that you don't like to talk about politics too much, so I'll try to personalize this slightly. Dealing with your patients. When you're giving a really bad diagnosis, when you're dealing with somebody who has a prognosis that's not going to, broadly, you're talking about the distribution of results, the results are not going to look good. How do you personally think about having that conversation? Because hopefully we can try to extrapolate that out to the wider response to this as a whole. I'm just curious, Doctor.
Right. So, there's a certain art of delivering bad news when patients not doing well. And I think providers who work with patients when this situation happens, often, let's say oncology, right, where a quite significant proportion of your patients is going to die from the disease you're diagnosing them with. It takes a certain personality. You have to be compassionate, but also clear, straight, and do offer what you can offer, and also stay with the patient no matter what happens, meaning that even if you don't have tools to cure someone, you always have tools to make them feel better. You always can make them comfortable with the tools we have. There's a field called palliative medicine or palliative care where even if we are unable to cure a disease, we can still offer relief from all the symptoms or most of the symptoms. It's a difficult art, and students take a long time to learn it. And when you're practicing, for me, the issue is it's always a new story. It's always a new patient. It's always different. You always think I know how to do this. I've done it 1,000 times, but on 1,001st, the problem presents so different and so acutely that it's always challenging.
And what about, just briefly following up, again, briefly, what about when you don't know what the result is? You don't know that it's good. You don't know that it's bad. You're still, doing test results. You're still trying to figure out what's happening. The tendency, I would imagine, on the part of some practitioners is to withhold, the worst possibilities because you don't want to freak the patient out. What's your take on that?
I think I would say probably often that's right. Because when you don't exactly know what you're facing, saying something overtly bad doesn't make any sense because you have to present information that you can sort of stand behind, right? And then presenting both best and worst scenarios is unwarranted. Although when the patient asks you directly, what could be here? I tend to answer honestly. I say, look, there is a spectrum of what can happen here. It can go from here to here, and depending on severity of this given condition, it could be really bad. But you also say, well, but the statistics are, and here's what study is showing, and then you explain that. But it's the problem here is with certain diseases, we know how they behave, and we know that reasonably well. Here we're facing with a situation where everybody's experience here is limited. I mean, sure, we have a lot of data now and some studies, but it's still evolving process. So what's happening today may not happen in 6 months, right? The illness in itself may look quite differently, both the symptom-wise and the frequency-wise and who's getting infected. There is a significant level of uncertainty. So I think I understand kind of maybe not trying to say, look, let's look at the always worst case scenario and panic.
Yeah, well, that's certainly not the right move. I'll take us into a brief break here, but what I was trying to get at is, from your perspective and working with people on a high level, inheriting the knowledge they would have either as practitioners or working closely with practitioners, what are best practices here? Because what's a best practice for a doctor working with a patient might not be a best practice for an epidemiologist working with a population, or it might be. But regardless, I wanted to go to you. We're going to be going into a break and coming back, talking about kids 5 through 11 working their way towards approval to get vaccinated. We're going to be going over multiple sides of that with Dr. Mikhail Kogan, Medical Director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, also Director of the AIM Health Institute. Check that out. That's based in Washington, D.C. That's healthaim.org. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Dr. Mikhail Kogan on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories, all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And we're continuing to speak with Dr. Mikhail Kogan on the COVID issue. And we're going to get into the COVID issue in relation to children. But just to give a bio, Dr. Mikhail Kogan is Medical Director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, Associate Professor of Medicine at George Washington University, and founder and Executive Director of the AIM Health Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. Dr. Mikhail Kogan, again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Does it concern you that we're basically putting kids in what seems like a perfect storm environment without basic protections for those kids, meaning kids they're not really getting vaccinated, at least not up to this point. And they're going into schools, and whether they wear masks and everything else, it is still a confined space. Those kids at some point are going to go home. And this, I don't believe for a moment that kids are going to be walking around the house with masks on, meaning whatever takes place in school gets transferred to the various people who are outside of school, be it principals, be it staff, or be it parents and everyone else. This seems like a perfect storm scenario, or am I being hyperbolic in the way that I'm thinking about this?
Oh, I think you're right, and we've already seen cases across the country of a massive local small areas flares where you would have large proportion of a class getting illness. Now, thank God that kids themselves get this really severe form quite rare. They do. And actually, there's been a significant increase in number of serious illness in kids. The thinking is that it's a combination of COVID combination of Delta with simply the fact that when you put somebody in a exposure for a prolonged period of time, like a classroom, right? I mean, they're sitting there for periods. That when the inoculum, so the amount of virus somebody gets is higher, they're going to get sicker. Versus when somebody picks it up, say, in a store where you're in and out for a few minutes, you're going to get much smaller inoculum, smaller amount of virus, so your illness is not going to end up being as severe.
That's the viral load idea, right?
Real concern. Yeah, it's called inoculum. Oh, exactly, viral load.
Very interesting. Basically, you're soaking in the virus that much more so. Wow. Do we know why this virus mutates in the way that it mutates? I mean, is this, well, I guess the first question, is it normal for a virus to mutate to the degree that it mutates? And do we know why? Is there any kind of science around why COVID is seeming to be, I guess, rare on this? Is it just because of the number of people who've been infected over the world?
Oh, I mean, all viruses mutate to some degree. The hope was that the COVID virus is not like flu, so it's going to mutate slower. So this was one of the general scientific errors from the beginning. And I don't know if you guys remember, if we go back quite a long time ago, at some point I predicted that we're going to have a bad strains. Not because I understand virology, actually, I don't. I'm not biologist from that sense. But, just from the perspective of a sheer volume of people exposed to the virus. And so if you look at things like flu, for example, the flu is a lot less infectious. And so the number of people who are getting exposed year after year, the pool itself is much smaller. So yes, if the virus can mutate really fast, even in a small pool of people, it will cause continuous mutations. But if the virus mutates slower, but the volume of people it can infect is much larger, where the pool of potential changes just very large, we're going to see this. And that's what, remember when we talked about uncertainty just a few minutes ago, that's the main thing or main factor, in my opinion, that says that, look, we actually don't know what's going to happen next year or year after. Because what if next variant of interest, next mutation is going to be so bad that it's going to be much worse? We just don't know. We can't say with absolute certainty that's not going to happen. Yes, it's unlikely, but it's possible. And I think that makes it, not just uncertain and challenging, it makes it, it is in a way, when you have that degree of uncertainty, it stresses us all, and it stresses us all severely, because living in that sense of uncertainty is one of the most stressful things we can have. We either going to blank it out, so we're just going to put it out of our unconsciousness. That's not necessarily the best reaction either. Or we're going to continuously rev our thinking about it and think, oh my God, what's next, right? So that's also unhealthy. So
suspending belief, suspending disbelief at the same time, that kind of thing. You don't think about it, you avoid it, often does lead to chronic degenerative stress. I hear you on that one. And another side of this, well, just briefly, we've only got so much time left, actually. What we were talking about, FDA approving, the COVID vaccine for kids ages 5 through 11, which they're saying is potentially feasible by Halloween. So that's less than a month and a half away. Just briefly, what's your take on that, Dr. Kogan? We've got maybe 30 seconds here.
Yeah, that's a very aggressive timeline. My understanding that Pfizer has not yet applied for the approval, and, I think it takes longer than that, but they have managed before to get certain approvals really fast.
Well, and this whole thing, just from last year, from the creation, the Operation Warp Speed and all that going into this year, of course, I would argue that it wasn't done quickly enough. Some would argue that it was done far too quickly, but it was fast. I'll put it like that. Dr. Mikhail Kogan, we're out of time. Great talking with you, as always. Common sense explanation of this stuff. Really, really appreciate it. Dr. Mikhail Kogan, Medical Director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, Associate Professor of Medicine at George Washington University, and the founder and Executive Director of the AIM Health Institute. That is a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. Check that out at healthaim.org. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours of this morning show.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would strongly insist that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, that's always an unnerving conversation. Basically, in perpetuity, far into the future, it is an unknown. And, that's unfortunate.
We're living in a bad timeline with this stuff. It could have been done better. And what I keep coming back to, what I'm really worried about, is not this one. It's not COVID with, extremely highly infective, but like a death rate of like less than 1% after you learn how to treat it well.
Yeah,
that
something
kind of
with a higher death rate.
What I'm worried about is something with a much higher death rate and how we respond to that, because that could knock a lot of people out. And this one has, that one really could. And if, this is setting us up for that, and I just don't think people would learn. I don't think people would trust any government around the world. Maybe a couple to respond to it properly, and therefore they're not going to follow the recommendations. It's not going to work. That's my concern.
Yeah, I feel you on that one. All right, let's go to the headlines. In the news, about 207,974 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, and there were 2,252 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 137,295 cases per day, an increase of 4% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 55% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 64% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 42,274,064 human beings in the United States and has killed 676,191 men, women, and children across the country. A 2-dose version of Johnson & Johnson coronavirus vaccine provides 94% protection against symptomatic infections, the company said on Tuesday, making a 2-dose regimen of Johnson & Johnson Janssen vaccine comparable to a 2-dose regimen of Moderna's or Pfizer's. Plus, the company said adding a booster dose to a single shot of the vaccine raised immunity even more and should also protect people strongly against infection. In national news, the White House stated yesterday that it will be lifting blanket travel restrictions to visitors as long as they can prove their vaccination status. Only fully vaxxed individuals will be able to tour and visit the United States. These new rules take effect in early November. When I was abroad, this was taking place basically when I was, I think I was in Tbilisi, and that's when Biden came on and they were putting in the new restrictions, and so was Europe putting in new restrictions. Yeah. A Yahoo News and YouGov poll shows that the majority of people in the United States are in favor of Roe v. Wade ruling. In the question of overturning the ruling, 55% were against this move, only 29% said they were in favor of unrestricted abortion access, and the vast majority believe there should be some laws implemented to restrict the process. Speaking of abortion laws, a Texas doctor is being sued for performing an abortion past the 6-week restriction outside of the permitted window under Texas law. Dr. Alan Braid became the first doctor to publicly violate the law and is being sued by an Arkansas man to, quote, try and test the constitutionality of the law, unquote. As the Biden administration deals with more than 15,000 migrants on the Texas border, new guidelines have come out saying they will prioritize single adult migrants. Some unaccompanied children and families will be allowed to stay in the United States for a temporary time before being deported, but many will be forcibly sent back to Haiti. All migrants, regardless of age or marital status, will be deported if they have not declared asylum status. According to the story by the Associated Press, nearly all Haitians reached the U.S. border through a well-worn route, fly to Brazil, Chile, or elsewhere in South America. If the jobs dry up, slowly move through South Central America and Mexico by bus or by foot to wait, perhaps years, in northern border cities like Tijuana for the right time to enter the United States and to claim asylum. That's important because we were trying to figure out, it just seemed very strange. In the past, you would have migrants coming through Florida or coming across on boat. But in this case, you had a large number of people basically coming through the Texas or Mexico border. It was just very strange. Jeff Bezos pledged $1 billion yesterday to conservation efforts in protecting the Earth. This is a whopping 0.49% of his net worth pledged for a greener planet. The United Nations General Assembly begins in earnest today after a musical appearance by the K-pop band BTS last night. And no, I'm not kidding. Almost 1 million viewers tuned into the event, flooding the chat with purple heart emojis. President Biden will speak today during his debut appearance at the meeting, following an extremely rocky 6 weeks, that's to put it mildly. On Wednesday, Biden also plans to present an international COVID-19 response plan. On Friday, Pacific leaders will meet. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled that Russia is responsible for the 2016 killing of Alexander Litvinenko. Litvinenko, thank you. The former Russian intel agent turned whistleblower defector was killed by radiation poisoning linked to a cup of green tea, and 2 Russian agents were found responsible. On the Russian side, there's still questions about the involvement of Mario Scaramella. 40 officers in Sudan have been arrested today after a failed military coup d'etat attempt. The officers were arrested after attempting to take over the state broadcaster's television building and the military general command. Interesting. The trial of the fraudulent tech founder Elizabeth Holmes is ongoing, and this week scientists formerly working for Theranos, the company she founded, are alleging that Holmes intimidated them into covering up evidence suggesting that blood analysis technology she was developing and selling didn't actually work. Holmes is on trial for fraud. And finally, Sam Adams is launching a new limited edition beer. The Utopias brand contains 28% alcohol by volume, making it illegal in 15 states. Only 13,000 bottles will be made, and an estimated price tag of $240 for a 25.4 ounce bottle. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Ooh. You know, it's very interesting. We're going to have the opportunity to speak with Susan Pai about the immigration one, so I'll hold off on that particular one. The White House, the travel ban, that is very wild to me, right? Because initially we were doing this thing where in order to get into the country, you would have to show your vaccination status in one case, but you would also have to show that you basically didn't have COVID as you were coming in. And so many of the airports abroad would have centers in the airport itself that would have these kind of rapid testing just in case, you know, you needed to get into one country after the next. Also, it seemed that as the cases were getting worse, the travel restrictions were basically being made almost like on the fly. So apparently we're going to be opening the travel ban or the blanket travel ban as long as people can show their status. Very interesting. I mean, at this point, though, the United States is the epicenter of this stuff. So, you know, it's like, you know, are people clamoring to get here in that context? Also, one other point, this idea that Joe Biden is going to give this kind of address into a global response to COVID. Are we really the world leader on this?
No.
Yeah, that's kind of my point. I mean, it's like, how do you get the standing? You have nearly 700,000 of your population that basically are dead over this virus. And to come out as if you are the world leader on this is a little tortured, to put it mildly. But who knows? We're exceptional.
Well, we're used to being exceptional.
Yeah.
But no, he's going to try to do this because it's the whole shoring up thing. You know what was funny for me was reading CNN talking about Biden going into this event. And they're like, what Biden needs to do in this event is show that he's not Trump. And I'm like, how many years in the past? Maybe it's not years. Maybe it's months or something like that. But I think you see what I'm saying.
Yeah. I don't even know what that means.
I don't know what that means either. Biden's, as far as his actions so far, I don't know that we said this on air. We were talking about this over the weekend. Biden, in my opinion at least, has done a lot worse in terms of international standing and affecting what the world thinks of America proper than Trump did or frankly could even. Because Trump, I'll put it like this, even just in these terms, Trump was always perceived, he was painted domestically and he was perceived, as far as I can tell, internationally, as a kind of a deviation, an exception, an aberration on the higher levels on the part of the American states. Sure, you know, intransigent populist voters put him into power here. Either that or you think that Russia did it somehow. But that's, for a lot of people internationally, that doesn't reflect on what they think of the State Department or the Pentagon or the White House proper.
Yeah.
Biden's actions totally do.
Yeah.
Biden screwing things up. Biden, bungling the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the French submarine deal. Those are the two big standout things here recently. That does far more damage than anything Trump did or could have done, frankly.
I don't know if it does more damage than he could have done, but I accept the point. It's a low bar for Trump. They didn't necessarily have these expectations of him when he got in office. And with Biden coming in, Biden's whole argument was the adults are back in session, America is back, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, you had one blunder after the next. And look, whatever you want to, think of it in that case. And I get that a lot of people greatly dislike Donald Trump, especially many of the world leaders. Well, at this point, this has nothing to do with Trump. This is all on Biden at this point.
Yes.
And so, this idea that he has to not be Trump, I don't know what that means.
They're caught in that past. I think that's what that means.
Yeah, they're locked into this mindset.
They don't have another frame.
Yeah, of reference.
Yeah.
For this. Yeah. And, like you said, this is one of those things that this is not something that Biden can put on Trump. At this point, this is Biden. He can say, well, Donald Trump was the one who wanted us to pull out of Afghanistan. Well, okay, but you decided to go along with it. And even when you decided to go along with it, you can't necessarily have it be a calamity in the way that it ended up being. And at the very least, it should come across as if you have an understanding of what is taking place on the ground and that you are clear on what's happening. That wasn't necessarily what came across. And like you said, the deal with France has been a massive blow up, whether it was they didn't care what France was going to take or how they were going to handle it, or they did it intentionally in order to pull back from the world. Either way, it still turned into a massive kerfuffle, to put it mildly. And this is going to have consequences in regards to how we engage Europe, especially on any kind of trade deal that takes place if France is going to have sore feelings about it. So,
yes.
Yeah. The speech is going to be very interesting. I think you said yesterday you'd kill to be a fly on the wall in that United Nations speech, or at the very least in the back room, they're hearing these guys.
I might kill a fly, but that's about all I'd kill to be. But no, it'd be fascinating.
Yeah.
It'd be super fascinating. The French submarine deal. I sent you the thread yesterday that I thought was very interesting. We're trying to get the guy who wrote it as a guest, basically going over, okay, what are the motivations on the Australian side to both get into this deal with France and then to pull out? One interesting thing that he brought up that I didn't know, France, one of the major powers, I kind of knew this in the back of my mind, but it's worth stating very clearly. France, one of the world's largest developers of nuclear technology.
Right.
So just take that as what it is. Germany pulling back from nuclear power. France has been apparently doubling down on it, investing more heavily. If you look at the percentage of nuclear energy that France gets, it's decently high compared to a lot of other nations. And they're, like I brought up, on the continent, UK has some nuclear submarines, but in the European Union and on the continent, they're the only nation with nuclear-powered subs. Yeah. So again, take that into consideration. They literally, when Australia went to them in this contract to get subs,
they specifically asked for conventional.
They specifically asked for conventional, and France literally had to design them new subs. They literally had to design new submarines for them, which is weird because Australia ultimately decided apparently to go for nuclear-powered submarines.
Right. Which very bizarre.
You'd think if you want that, just get that from them in the first place. Now, that would also explain, some people have been coming to Australia's defense sort of saying, well, the manufacturing delays, how long it's going to take. For one thing, of course, it's going to take longer if they literally have to design new submarine systems up from scratch because you're not buying the product that they're used to selling. For another thing, though, is the United States really the best party to go to for like expedited military products? Have you seen how long it takes us to build our aircraft? Have you seen, I think everybody has, how much we delay the creation of our military technology?
Yeah.
How much it tends to run over budget and how much longer it takes than you'd expect at the start of the project, or at least you would read at the start of the project in terms of what their expectations are.
Well, in the best case scenario, this is going to take like a decade. I mean, don't quote me specifically on a decade, but it's going to take years for them to even get the first one in, let alone the other ones. This is very weird. I mean, he made the point, like, basically that the only subs France have is nuclear subs. And that, because one of the things that came out of the deal was, well, we didn't want the conventional subs. Well, they didn't have conventional subs in the first place. It's just very, very weird stuff.
And you know what? France is also, I didn't realize this, but it's also worth stating, the world's third largest arms exporter behind the United States and Russia.
Yeah.
You might not think of that necessarily. France doesn't come to the top of a lot of people's minds when it comes to the military stuff, especially after the white flags in World War II. I don't mean to be too critical, but it's an old World War II joke. But especially after that, like you wouldn't necessarily associate them with that. So here's one, I'm just putting this out there as a speculation to try to work my way into the territory. What if the United States really doesn't want France to become one of the world's largest exporters of arms specifically? What if they want the EU to broadly remain demilitarized, as has been our policy through NATO for like many decades, up to Trump basically, either selectively militarizing to a limited extent or basically keeping it demilitarized broadly. Putting our armaments in there, but for the most part, you guys should keep your stuff on the down low. What if we wanted them to not do this? We had Australia on its own. Again, this gets conspiratorial. Australia decides to start a lucrative long-term deal. Then Australia yanks the French chain, pulls out of it, pivots to the United States. France is left spinning adrift effectively, and the United States gets the contract. And most importantly, this was a big contract from Ledroit's own words, the French foreign minister's own words. Suddenly they don't have it. So it is a legitimate hit to their economy. It's a legitimate hit to their own little military industrial complex. And all the while, we're left slightly profiting from it. Unfortunately, again, regardless, set that aside for a minute. That's my own speculative theory. Regardless, we have screwed France with this move. And it's very clear from how they view us that they see us as screwing them with this move. On the one hand, we want them to be our ally. We want the European Union to stick with us. And on the other hand, we're basically, telling them to go F themselves with this deal. What am I missing?
Well, I agree with you that from the business standpoint, well, of course, we want the contract, right? I mean, all things being equal, whether we want or care that France has their own kind of military thing is almost secondary to the fact that all things being equal, we're selling weapons. We're the number one weapon supplier. We want them to buy them from us. I guess the question is, though, why did it break down in the way that it broke down? Meaning, you're asking us for something specific. Okay, fair enough. And we're going to bill you that specific thing. And then you turn around and say, well, they couldn't provide us what we wanted, despite the fact that what you asked for was something different. It's very weird. That's all. And so you're probably right that all things being equal, the U.S. would prefer maintaining its kind of hegemonic militaristic dominance over Europe.
Yeah.
So I don't doubt that at all.
When it comes to speculation, who knows?
Yeah, but all things being equal, I mean, we've had this kind of policy of them deferring to our foreign policy for decades at this point. And I have a hard time believing that the country would want that to change. I mean, there's a certain amount of clout and influence when you have that level of military dominance and Europe is basically deferring to your own military matters. And part of the thing of, the vassal state stuff on some level boils down to Europe not being able to defend itself because Europe doesn't invest in its military in those ways. So I wouldn't be shocked at all if the United States took the policy that, yeah, we don't want you guys to expand in your military in this way. On some level that undermines our influence for you to do so. I also wouldn't necessarily be shocked by the whole thing of all things being equal, yeah, we would prefer you buy from us since we're a supplier. I guess the thing becomes, though, in the way that we screw them over in this deal, it's that part that seems, particularly brash.
And I kind of I think Brave is ultimately right about this before I went all awkward and confusing after he called in at the very end of the show yesterday. But Brave called in. He had a couple of points. His last point was basically, there is no leadership. There is nobody at the, steering the ship. It's a bunch of bureaucracies with internal infighting. Bureaucracies in the White House, the State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA, just to name a few of them, but the most prominent ones. They're all competing with each other. They all, have shared motives partly, but also they want to do different things and they have different MOs, So it's not like there necessarily is an actual answer to why we did this. There's not a one-sentence answer. There's a he said, she said sort of, well, this party wanted this, that party wanted that. That seems like a very reasonable and probable explanation of it to me. We've got to go into our break. We're going to be coming back talking about immigration, specifically these Haitian immigrants on the Texas border. Ted Cruz was there on the scene the morning after. Kamala Harris, however, last I checked, was flipping the coin at the Howard University football game that took place this Sunday when this whole thing was going down. In other words, the person that Biden put in charge of our immigration crisis was nowhere to be seen. We're going to be talking about why that is, the recent history on this immigration stuff, what's going on with these Haitian immigrants, what's coming next with Susan Pye. On the other side of this short break, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We're going to get into the immigration issue. As we discussed earlier today, there are 15,000 immigrants on the Texas border, and new guidelines have been coming out that will prioritize single and adult migrants. Now, some adult children or unaccompanied children and families will be allowed to stay in the United States for a temporary time, but many are basically going to be deported and expelled from the country with post-haste. Many of the migrants, regardless of this has been a very weird story, and part of it has to do with the route that many of the Haitian migrants are taking in order to get into the country. So in order to have a conversation about this, we're joined with Susan Pye. She has a degree in psychology from UCLA, where she worked as an internationally recognized UCLA brain mapping lab. She attended law school at the University of Louisville and Nyoga University in Japan, and has assisted the Senate Judiciary Committee on fraud and abuse issues in business, immigration, and civil matters. Susan has also submitted testimony to the House Judiciary Committee on humanitarian and immigration issues. Susan, thank you for joining us.
Good morning. How are you?
We're doing fine. Better that you are with us. And so we've been having a conversation about this issue with the Haitian migrants that seems to kind of explode almost overnight. And I know it didn't necessarily explode overnight, but it seemed to hit the media pretty heavily. The other day, I think it was 12,000. That number went up. It's at 15,000 at this point. We thought it was very strange that the route that was being taken. Initially, I remember they used to come through Florida. Why are they coming through Texas at this point? Like, what's the route that they're taking in order to get from Haiti to Texas?
Okay, so this goes all the way back to the large earthquake that was like 7 point something back in 2010. After that earthquake devastated Haiti, many Haitians flew to South America via Ecuador because Ecuador does not require any visas for Haitian nationals. So from Ecuador, they settled in South and Central America and Mexico. And actually about 10,000 Haitians have been stuck in Mexico, following that trip, from Haiti to Ecuador and then on to Mexico for a number of years. So some estimates are about 5 years. So that the 10,000 and 12,000 and 15,000 Haitians appearing at the southern border is not a surprise because they've been waiting for so many years in South and Central America. And even though I think that they were mistaken, and certainly that's what the current administration is signaling, they think they have a short window of opportunity to apply for legal status in the United States right now. And in fact, some of them are even chanting at the border, Joe Biden, Joe Biden.
Why, if this wasn't surprising, and I'm trying to quote you, but I probably am getting the exact words wrong. You said something like this isn't a surprise. You know, this is the kind of thing you can see coming. If this isn't a surprise, why is it surprising? Why is this happening suddenly? Why is this becoming a major story? Why did, first and foremost, our government not sort of preemptively respond to it in some way?
Well, I think the reason it's a surprise to people is because they've seen migrant caravans, organized caravans, migrating to the southern border as a large unit when the nationals were South and Central American. But this is the first time they've seen Haitian nationals appearing at our southern border. And so I don't think it's within the common knowledge that people understand a lot of Haitians, left Haiti after the big earthquake and settled in Central and South America. And like I said, they now, whether mistakenly or not, and I think this has something to do with the psychology of them thinking, because just a few months ago, we offered temporary protected status to Haitians who are already in the United States because of the earthquake, and then later because of the assassination of their president and the political unrest that followed. They mistakenly think that there's this short window of opportunity for them to apply for legal status for legal admission into the United States from the southern border. And I believe this caravan was organized just like the other caravans were organized, even throughout the Trump administration. So in that sense, it's not a surprise. I think it's just surprising in the media because it's Haitian nationals.
Very interesting. Not to mention it's coming through Texas, as opposed to, let's say, coming by boat or through Florida. Also, it also makes sense that considering everything that just took place with the assassination, that all of a sudden, like you said, it's a short window of opportunity that they believe they can take advantage of. Considering what's taking place in Haiti, either from gangs or either from violence or poverty, what are there asylum laws that follow or that cover the people who are trying to get in through the Texas border? There are 15,000 at this point. Are there any kind of laws around asylum for people who will go back into, more dangerous situations?
Well, I think that the Haitian National Caravan is different from all the former caravans in that the people who are applying for asylum, many of them will be considered to have settled in a third country prior to their asylum application. And if you have firmly resettled in a third country, you cannot then make an asylum claim to a better country. So if, for example, you had a good job in construction and you lived for 5 years in Brazil, and then you join the caravan and you appear at the southern border and apply for asylum based on race, religion, national membership in a particular social group or political opinion, the first question they're going to ask you is, where have you been living the last 5 years? And if your answer is in Brazil, okay, then you don't have an asylum application because you firmly resettled in a third country, right?
In other words, they had already found not a home exactly, but there was another place that they'd sort of been de facto living in asylum in. Grammar was off, but I think you get my point. Is that the idea there, Susan?
Correct. And then just independent of that, I think the disconnect in asylum law in the United States, just overall, not only with regards to this particular case, is that the bar that you have to reach, in order to make an asylum claim is really far and away, very distant from the bar that you have to reach to ultimately win your asylum claim. However, between the time that you make a credible fear interview at the border and meet that low bar and the time that you get your day in court, it could be many, many years, like 5, 6, 7, even 9 years. And during that period of time, I think that's where people have the problem, is that then the person who is applying for asylum would be released into the United States to await the disposition of their case. And in the meantime, for 7, 8, 9 years, they're living in the United States, even though ultimately they may lose their asylum claim.
Very interesting. What does that mean for the context of work? What does that mean in a sense of, if they're waiting years at that point, how does that work in practice? I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, while you are in the asylum process, which could take such a long time, you have the legal ability to work and drive and live in the United States without fear of being deported, unless, of course, you commit, a serious crime that renders you deportable. So the question with this particular group is, the Biden administration has, with other groups and even with Haitians that arrived before this week, been allowing family units to remain in the United States while their asylum case is pending. So the question is he going to do the same thing for this group? And I don't think he will be. I think that he'll actually be using what we call the Title 42 public health law that Trump used quite effectively to deport even family units back to Haiti. So if you think about it, what Biden is going to do, and they've already started doing this, expatriating people back to Haiti using Title 42, they're going to be left in a worse position than if they had never applied for asylum or shown up at the border at all. So what you're saying now, even within that group of 15,000 Haitian nationals at the border, is that some of them are seeing, okay, they are, flying back even Haitian families. So I don't want to go back to Haiti because, it's a very poor country. It's very violent. Whether or not they have the valid asylum claims, there's been 2 earthquakes there. I need to just apply for asylum in Mexico, or I need to go back to Brazil and apply for status there.
And that's what's happening. Susan, I want to take us into a brief break. When we come back, I want to get into your work, what you do, what your perspective on immigration is generally, and what you think about the administration's response to this stuff, not just this year, not just last year, but over the recent decades, basically. It's great to speak with you. Hope we don't spend too much time on that. It's a longer conversation, so we'll try to be brief, of course. We're joined by Susan Pai. She has a degree in psychology from UCLA. She worked at the internationally recognized UCLA Brain Mapping Lab. Very cool. She attended law school at the University of Louisville and at Nagoya University in Japan. She has assisted the Senate Judiciary Committee on fraud and abuse issues in business, immigration, civil matters, also submitted testimony to the House Judiciary Committee on humanitarian immigration issues. As folks can hear, a great guest to talk to about this stuff. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Susan on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. And we are going back to our guest, Susan Pai. Susan Pai has a degree in psychology from UCLA, where she worked as an internationally recognized UCLA Brain Mapping Lab. And as Shane said, that is very cool. She attended law school at the University of Louisville and Nagoya University in Japan, and has assisted the Senate Judiciary Committee on fraud and abuse issues in business, immigration, and civil matters. Susan, thank you again for joining us on the show to speak about immigration. Let's get into the policies that the United States takes on immigration in general. How have you, from your perspective and just from your experience in all of this, let's say, recent spat of immigration issues, either when Biden first took office with families or with children being allowed in, and with the changing of, let's say, the laws or changing of the policies from Trump. And even now, it seems that the country, or at the very least the administration, has been mired in immigration issues even more so than the previous administration. What is going on in this? How do you view what has been taking place over the course of the last few years?
Well, I think this actually goes back decades, where the set of immigration laws, it really needs to be comprehensively reformed in many ways. And that doesn't mean, taking the side of the Democrats or taking the side of the Republicans. It's just the system is just broken. It just doesn't work. So like I said, in asylum cases, you have a very low bar to pass a credible fear claim in order to make an asylum claim, and then you're released into the United States. Or if you're, from certain countries that Mexico allows to remain in Mexico, you remain in Mexico while your asylum case plays out. And by the way, the Supreme Court just ratified that and said that this administration has to continue to follow the remain in Mexico policy. But yeah, and then waiting 7, 8, 9, 10 years, maybe with what I would consider as a lawyer like a patently bad asylum case. But nevertheless, you in that 7, 8, or 9 years, you're going to put down roots in the United States. You're going to have children. You might get married. So it's sort of it just doesn't make any sense, that there's such a high bar where only, say, the top 3% of all asylum cases filed actually pass, the ultimate decision-making of the immigration judge, and they win those asylum cases versus, like, the very opposite on the bottom with the credible fear. So there are a lot of things like that. There's,
Wait, just so I'm clear, only 3% pass the bar in order to win the case for immigration, even though getting into the country, or at the very least getting that first initial step, is a much higher, meaning most people can pass the threshold for, okay, yes, I'm scared and I want to apply for asylum, but only 3% gets accepted, despite the fact that it takes years for the process to basically get to the point where the 3% is accepted. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, and I would say 3% is representative of the more strict courts, jurisdictions across the United States. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that it averages out to not more than 10%. So that only the top 10% survive the final disposition of the case. That's correct. So 90% of the people who are released into the United States during the pendency of their asylum claim, ultimately they will lose their case. But by the time somebody's been here or their family's been here 7, 8, or 9 years, they're not going to give up so easily on other immigration avenues, because they've settled here.
And so what happens to them? What do those people do?
So, I get a lot of people like that, and there are some avenues for them. Some of them might qualify for DACA. Some of them might get married to a United States citizen. That happens often. Some of them get in abusive relationships, and they have a way to apply for a green card, if they've been in an abusive relationship with a U.S. citizen, if they've been the victim of a crime. So there are many different things that can happen over the course of 7, 8, or 9 years that will offer them an avenue to a green card, even if they were to ultimately lose their asylum application or their asylum case.
A couple of those are truly interesting. You're saying abusive relationship, or if they're a victim of a crime. So effectively, if they were aggrieved, if they were wronged, if they were hurt by somebody in the United States legally, how does that connect to asylum? I just don't understand that, Susan.
It doesn't connect to asylum, but it's something, there are things that happen to people, during their 7, 8, or 9 years here while they're awaiting their asylum case to be heard in court. And oftentimes that marriage, being in an abusive relationship, being a victim of a crime, or they might qualify under DACA for some of the ones that came in earlier. So there are a variety of things. The reason that the Haitians are waiting in Del Rio instead of just sneaking into the United States is they want to be lawfully admitted to the United States, because some of these other things that come up during the 7, 8, or 9 years, like marriage or being a victim of a crime, or being the victim of abuse, you can't change status to being a green card holder if you don't have a lawful admission. So as long as you have that lawful admission, you can then take advantage of maybe some other avenues of legalization that will become available to you while you're in the United States, waiting for your asylum case to be heard.
Wow. Have you seen some of the items that were taking place at the border? There were difficulties in regards to sanitation, but there were also agents that were beating some of the people who were there with whips while they were riding horseback. I mean, is this level of abuse normal in regards to how we deal with immigrants? I mean, they're the lowest rung of the ladder in regards to the population itself. This seems abnormal to me, but I don't necessarily know. What's going on in association with this? Why is the violence that pernicious in this particular case?
I think that the first problem is the ratio of law enforcement to the crowd. So where you only have hundreds of enforcement officers and, trying to control a crowd of thousands, or trying to prevent people who are going across the river back to Mexico from coming back, right? It's just not a feasible situation for any law enforcement officer. And I'm former law enforcement. I was a prosecutor. And so I think that's the first problem. The second problem, I think, just the visual aspect of the pictures that came out were highly inflammatory because, of course, it's like a scene out of Django. You see like somebody that looks like they're whipping, a Haitian national. I mean, I think it goes to the heart of like all the things that in the United States that we're very ashamed of, in our past history. Mm-hmm. So I think it was just a jarring image. But do I think there's abuse, within the immigration enforcement system? I have friends who are officers, but I also think that, yes, there is a great deal of abuse because a lot of it is not it's not like it's a U.S. citizen who's going to be here after the abuse occurs. Oftentimes the abuse happens and then the person is returned to their country, and there's not much that they can do from there. So I'll give you an example of one of the really egregious cases of abuse where it was two ICE officers who are sitting on an apartment building, where a lot of undocumented aliens are known to live, and a teenager comes out with a backpack, gets on his bike, and starts riding his bike. They start shouting at him to stop because they just assume he's undocumented instead of, maybe being a Latino American on his way to school. And this kid gets so scared, I believe he was 16 or 17, that he picks up his bike and he runs across like 6 lanes of a very busy thoroughfare, gets hit by a truck, and dies on the scene.
That is dark. That is very, very dark. I mean, what? Right. Wow. From the standpoint of ICE, I mean, ICE has been one of those organizations that has a ignoble, let's say, history, to put it mildly, especially during the Trump administration. I mean, what are the powers available to ICE that aren't necessarily available to the other organizations to do stuff like this? I mean, basically, they're getting people with the notion of deporting. How does that apply to what's taking place here? Were some of the ICE agents called in to assist with the border issue?
From what I understand, there were 600 additional agents who were called in, and 400 of them were ICE agents. And then presumably the 200 were Border Patrol agents. And then I had heard even from our own governor here in Florida that he had sent our law enforcement down to the border, although I don't know under, what power he did that. So do they have powers that other law enforcement do not? They do not. I think what the issue is with ICE is that they often don't follow their own guidelines. So, for example, like in the case where the teenager was killed, they're not supposed to engage in chase or vehicular chases or pedestrian vehicular chases, except under very, very narrow circumstances that are very similar to local law enforcement guidelines. But the problem is that, and I don't know if it's because the agency is so large and because it has federal jurisdiction that it's just harder to manage, but oftentimes our immigration agents, don't have a good idea of what their limitations are, or they don't follow them, and that can lead to tragedy. And I think what is really markedly different in like today's time versus like even 10 years ago is that now people are recording local law enforcement so ubiquitously, like everybody has like a tape recorder, in their phone or a video recorder. And that I don't see that happening with federal law enforcement or like with ICE agents as much as with local law enforcement.
So in other words, we hear about abuse, but it's much murkier, and there aren't specific examples of it that can be brought up evidentiarily, that kind of thing. Just briefly, is that what you mean?
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, a couple more questions. We're just about out of time, but Susan, thank you so much for joining us. I'll try to be brief here.
Sure.
This is your business in some sense, but I'm also imagining it involves your emotions. You're having to deal with people who are facing, this is their life, this is their family, this is their fate in a deeper sense. They're trying to, get some real long-term stability for themselves. If you had a microphone or you were on WhatsApp talking with these Haitian immigrants and other immigrants trying to come up to the States in general, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to apply for asylum in Mexico or in another South or Central American country, that they have familiarity with, because otherwise they're going to get put on a plane and get sent back to Haiti, where nobody wants to be right now.
And by the way, many of these people haven't been in Haiti for a very, very long time, even though they're going to be deported to Haiti either way, correct?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And then one brief follow-up. Short answer. I really appreciate it. One brief follow-up. Similar question, but addressed to the government, to our government. What, if you had a microphone, if you were on their Slack channel, whatever, what would you recommend?
I would just tell them to stop lying and just get their act together and, actually do something that's good for the country in terms of reforming immigration instead of using it as a political football. That's all it is nowadays.
What would that be, by the way, if they did make a change for the better in immigration? Let's say people could come together and the best outcome wasn't out of reach. What would that change be from your experience with this?
Okay, so let's say from a fiscal perspective, as a U.S. taxpayer, we have this congressional bed mandate where we have to fill X number of beds per day. And because if we don't fill them, we're paying for them whether they're empty or not. Okay, we should not be paying $5 million a day for empty beds, right? So that's an easy change in congressional law where you could say we only pay for the beds that we fill. A bigger, more esoteric issue would be there's a 5 or 10 year bar from returning into the United States once you've been here unlawfully for over 6 months or over a year. But in actuality, people who are working here and sending back money to their home countries and, building houses and buying farmland and doing that, they would actually voluntarily return to their country if we got rid of the 5 or 10 year bar. Meaning if they had the opportunity to come here and work, if their work was needed, if their labor was needed, they would come and work legally, and then they would voluntarily return to their country to live. So I think, and that's just a primary foundational thing in immigration law that needs to change.
But it's a kind of perverse incentive. We're basically, we're trying to keep them out if they overstay, but they're incentivized to overstay because, if they were to go home, they wouldn't be able to come back. Susan.
That's exactly right.
Susan, great conversation. Really appreciate you joining us. It's been a while, but we're really glad to have you back on, and hopefully we can get you back on soon because it was absolutely an informative, enlightening conversation talking with you about this stuff. Very even-handed and comprehensive. Don't mean to be too flattering, but really appreciate it. Susan Pai, for those listening, has a degree in psychology from UCLA. She worked at the internationally recognized UCLA Brain Mapping Lab. She attended law school at the University of Louisville and at Nagoya University in Japan. And she's assisted the Senate Judiciary Committee on fraud and abuse issues in business, immigration, civil matters. Also submitted testimony to the House Judiciary Committee on humanitarian immigration issues. Again, Susan Pai, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're continuing this conversation in another vein, turning now to Haiti proper, looking at recent political developments, of course, talking about this migrant issue as well, but also talking about, post-assassination, the Supreme Court, head of the Supreme Court, basically saying the country's current president may have been involved in the assassination of the previous president. A lot going on there. We're going to be getting into it with our next guest, Danny Shaw, Professor Danny Shaw. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us. From mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined on the line by Professor Danny Shaw. Professor Shaw is an international affairs analyst and professor of Latin American studies at CUNY, that's City University of New York. Follow Danny on Twitter at Danny Shaw CUNY. That's Danny Shaw, CUNY. Professor Shaw, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Good morning, Shane. Good morning, Jamal.
Great to have you. Let's get into it. We're talking about Haiti. We were just speaking, of course, about the Haitian immigrants. That brings this story to mind, but I've been seeing rumblings for weeks now. Well, it really goes back to the assassination of Jovenel Moïse a couple of months ago. But basically, ongoing political infighting on the highest levels, with the Supreme Court alleging that the current president was involved in the assassination of Moïse. Have you been following this? What's your take on this, Professor Shaw?
Yeah, there's still 44 suspects in custody. 18 of them are Colombian mercenaries. Other Colombian mercenaries were already killed. So there's so much unanswered questions right now. All types of palace intrigue, the infighting that you mentioned, one faction of the Haitian bourgeoisie and the core group. Nothing happens in Haiti without the U.S. and Canada and the OAS and the UN weighing in, of course, through the U.S. Embassy. And it's clear right now they're behind Ariel Henry, but it looks like this new prime minister had a falling out with Claude Joseph, the previous prime minister. And Jaina Flores, one of the detained Colombian mercenaries, came forward and talked about how there were multiple plots against Jovenel Moïse. But again, objectively, I don't think this means much to the everyday people of Haiti, whether it's Henri Joseph or the deceased Jovenel Moïse. It's the same class struggle. It's the same struggle against imperialism. So I don't even think the Haitian people are so caught up on all of these details. They know it was both an inside job, and for them it's so hypocritical that then the FBI and the Colombian security forces, the ones most culpable, are now the ones in charge of this entire investigation that's been going on for months now.
Very interesting. What is the key question that is yet to be answered, or for that matter, potentially even asked, in regards to all of this that's taken place, the assassination of Moïse?
There's some rumors that Jovenel Moïse was pivoting away from the U.S., but I never saw proof of that. There's always a rumor mill producing, ripe rumors in Haiti, but I never saw anything progressive in Jovenel Moïse. I mean, imperialism could have used him as a fall guy to say, well, he's so unpopular, and there's millions of Haitians in the streets against his neoliberal puppet rule. Let's put a new face into power. Let's get rid of the Trump-esque figure and bring in kind of a Biden, to use a simple U.S. analogy, perhaps oversimplified, but kind of meets our purpose for right now. But I never saw any proof that there was anything anti-imperialist, anything progressive. Jovenel Moïse was the ultimate mediocrity, a banana businessman, no prior political experience, someone who was artificially parachuted into power, never had any popular support. But still, of course, any time that the highest representative of a country, whether he was democratically elected or not, is taken out in this type of gung-ho fashion, and you're talking about 26 different Colombian mercenaries involved, I think that's the biggest question. The question that the Miami Herald and the Wall Street Journal won't ask: how are there paid Colombian mercenaries involved in a sovereign country who are ultimately responsible for this? So that's the question that people are asking across the hemisphere, but those headlines are noticeably absent in the U.S.
From the standpoint of what is taking place now, immediately after the assassination, I mean, I would imagine there's all sorts of, palace intrigue or chaos. I mean, how has the country been trying to pull itself back together? I mean, and it's not just from this crisis. I mean, there was the earthquake that was also there that created all sorts of havoc and an inability for the country to basically mend itself after such. What is taking place now in Haiti after this assassination?
Yeah, and this is the context that's completely absent from both the liberal and conservative coverage in the U.S. right now. we hear about these 15,000 mostly Haitian migrants, I would say survivors of imperialism, refugees, resistors of imperialism under the Del Rio bridge camp. And these 15,000 human beings, a lot of them have been on this journey post-2010 after the massive earthquake that rocked Port-au-Prince, Haiti's capital. This past earthquake was in Les Cayes in the south. But it's post-2010 that the Haitian diaspora is not just based in Brooklyn and southern Florida, Miami, but there's a massive Haitian diaspora in Chile and in Brazil. But then with COVID and less jobs in Chile, less possibilities to survive in Brazil, a lot of these Haitian migrants are forced to head north to Mexico, to the U.S. border. There were rumors that there was an opening in Del Rio. So that's why we see these extremely alarming images of U.S. Border Patrol reminiscent of the Jim Crow South, reminiscent of the U.S. invasion of Haiti in 1915 when U.S. Marines used similar whips to beat back the Haitian resistance. We see these alarming images emerging this weekend, which I think captures in a very poignant, tragic, and white supremacist way the relationship that continues to exist, this neo-colonial relationship between the U.S. and between Haiti. This is the historical context. This is the geopolitical context that CNN, Fox News, Breitbart, the full gamut of the mainstream will not mention. So we hear these border agents lecturing the Haitians, cursing out the Haitians and lecturing them on how they should stay back in Haiti and fight for Haiti, which is a huge myth that Haitians need to stay put because Haitians have been fighting. We're talking about a nation of poets, of maroons, of revolutionaries, of resistors who've really given all of humanity an example. And the Haitian people are asking, when will we be given a chance to actually survive in our own land? We don't want to migrate, but you've left us no other choice.
What are the conditions in Haiti right now? I mean, I had a friend of mine who was there for maybe a year or so, and she loved it. By the same token, you know, she had no illusions about the violence or the corruption. I think for her, her thing was the level of corruption was breathtaking. And from the standpoint of the government and everything else, that it didn't have any kind of credibility within regards to the public itself, meaning the public was so disenchanted that they had no expectations in regards to what the government was going to do outside of being corrupt or outside of fealty to other powers. Would that be somewhat of a true assessment on that? And what needs to take place for any of that to change?
Yeah, Haiti is this tiny sliver of the Upper East Side in a massive Bronx, if you will. It's the 99.9% scrambling day to day to survive. And then there's this tiny, tiny elite, super light-skinned mulatto that presides up in the hills of Pétionville, and they live as if they were in Miami Beach or in Beverly Hills. It's ridiculous when you can actually go and see Haiti with your own eyes. And, oh, we've been told so much this is the poorest country. What's the most unequal country? It's the most manipulated country. It's the most exploited and oppressed country, but there's nothing poor about Haiti. This morning, the Haitian good, the Haitian currency was at 98 for $1 US dollar. And these are the everyday realities that the Haitian people have to face. So if you can get any type of work in US dollars anywhere in the US or in the diaspora, it's worth risking your life and the life of your children to try to survive. There's this constant dispossession of the Haitian peasantry. Historically, Haiti was a very rural country, and I visited just 2 months ago with these Haitian peasants, and they're asking, how can we survive? We have no land, we have no rights.
Professor Shaw, we're going to have to end it there. I really appreciate this meeting. The voice that you guys were listening to is Professor Danny Shaw, International Affairs Analyst and Professor of Latin American Studies at University of New York. You can follow him on Twitter at Danny Shaw Cooney. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another an hour, really our last hour this morning, of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'll be honest, it's completely unconscious and unintentional. I've started to say the divided globe thing very consistently after we came back into the studio, Jamarl. You noticed that, right? And I like literally hadn't thought it through at all. Okay, that sounds good. And, geopolitically, things are getting more divided. But then I look to my right and your left, and we literally have a giant TV screen showing a globe divided. And I hadn't connected the dots now. Anyway.
Subconscious is screwing with you.
Exactly. Well, it's setting me up. Freudian slip kind of a thing. Anyway, let's get into headlines. First up in COVID news, there are about 208,000 new COVID cases, which were reported in the United States yesterday. There were also 2,252 deaths reported. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 137,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 4% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 55% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 64% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 42,274,000 people across the United States and killed 676,191 people in the U.S. A two-dose version of Johnson & Johnson's coronavirus vaccine provides 94% protection against symptomatic infection, the company said Tuesday. That makes a two-dose regimen of J&J's Janssen vaccine comparable to a two-dose regimen of Moderna's or Pfizer's. Plus, the company said adding a booster shot to a single shot of the vaccine raised immunity even more. Should also protect people strongly against infection. So J&J switching up their one-shot dose, not switching up, adding in a two-shot dose is a possibility with more protection, and that would be one of the, I believe, one of the adenovirus-based vaccines, not the mRNA one, which solely, so far as I can tell, Moderna and Pfizer here in the States have been doing. Anyway, in national news, the White House stated yesterday that they will be lifting blanket travel restrictions to visitors as long as they can prove their vaccination status. Only fully vaxxed individuals will be able to tour and visit the U.S. These new rules will take effect in early November. You disapprove of that, Jamarl?
No, it's not that. It's the New York Times has an article that basically is saying where are the tests, and it's saying how other countries around the world have tests pretty much everywhere, like outside of drug companies and everything else, where the United States is not so much. Like, it's not necessarily a wash-in test. It takes more than 24 hours to get the results and everything else. It was something we were talking about, I think it was like last week, this notion that if they expand the testing market, okay, how would we even be able to expand the number of testing to accommodate the people who may want to get the test as opposed to getting the vaccine? And it seems that the answer to that is, at this point, no. That's what I was shaking my head at.
Makes sense. And this was based, if you remember, on the OSHA conversation we were having.
Exactly.
About the new rules. Basically, any business over 100 employees would need to either have their employees vaccinated or test them. And I believe it was a weekly basis.
Yes.
That's a lot of tests.
It's like twice a week.
Yeah. We had a conversation. And interestingly enough, like most of the callers that morning were on that topic. People, they're agreeing with us, disagreeing with us. It was interesting.
I mean, they're making the point. You can get COVID tests in France outside of tents, outside of pharmacies. In Germany, they have abandoned nightclubs. In many countries, you can either self-administer at home. We have some test kits at home, but those aren't necessarily as official. But, for yourself, if like when we were looking for testing or anything else, you have to find very specific places as opposed to them being ubiquitous and all over. Ubiquitous and all over would be far better if we were trying to keep an eye on spread and people wanted to know who they were being infected. Even, by the way, even if they didn't get the vaccine, you still should want to know one way or the other, so you're not necessarily infectious. It would be far easier if these things were available, fast, and easy. And
it would be. That would be the right way to do a COVID response, not the terrible bungling of it. Yeah. Again, Biden's going to be talking. I'll get back to headlines. Yeah, because this is coming.
But that's
up
what I was shaking my head for. It wasn't the headline. It was.
Totally
I was like, oh, that's horrible. It was none of that.
No, valid and good to get in. I want to come back to Biden speaking on Wednesday. We'll be getting back to that in a couple of minutes. Anyway, in national news, the White House stated yesterday... I already got through this one. A Yahoo News and YouGov poll shows that a majority of people in the United States are in favor of the Roe v. Wade ruling. In the question of overturning the ruling, 55% were against this move. Only 29% said they were in favor of unrestricted abortion access. The vast majority believe there should be some laws implemented to restrict the process. Speaking of abortion laws, a Texas doctor is being sued for performing an abortion past the six-week restriction that's outside of the permitted window under new Texas law. Dr. Alan Braid became the first doctor to publicly violate the law. He is being sued by an Arkansas man to, quote, try to test the constitutionality of the law, end quote. As the Biden administration deals with more than 15,000 migrants on the Texas border, new guidelines have come out saying they will prioritize single adult migrants. Some unaccompanied children and families will be allowed to stay in the U.S. for a temporary time before being deported, but many will be forcibly sent back to Haiti. All migrants, regardless of age or marital status, will be deported if they have not declared asylum status. Great conversation with Susan Pye last hour from 8:15 to about 8:50. Great talk. Go back and listen to that one if you're interested in this one in the slightest bit. According to a story by the Associated Press, nearly all Haitians reach the U.S. border on a well-worn route. They fly to Brazil, Chile, or elsewhere in South America. And if jobs dry up there, they'll slowly move through Central America and Mexico by bus and on foot to wait, sometimes for years, in fact, quite often for years, in northern border cities like Tijuana. They're waiting for the right time to enter the United States and claim asylum. This is one of those times, apparently, but they're being pushed away. And Jeff Bezos pledged $1 billion yesterday to conservation efforts in protecting the Earth. That's a whopping 0.49% of his net worth, pledged for getting this planet greener. The CDC is investigating a salmonella outbreak that has been detected in 25 different states, infected 127 people so far, and has hospitalized 18. While the source is unknown, many of the infected have been found to have eaten at the same restaurants, creating subclusters of outbreaks. The CDC recommends practicing segregated storage for foods, thawing them in refrigerators, and cooking food thoroughly before consuming. Jeez. In international news, the UN General Assembly begins in earnest today after a musical appearance by the K-pop band BTS last night. And no, I'm not kidding. Almost 1 million viewers tuned into the event. They flooded the chat with purple heart emojis. President Biden will speak today during his debut appearance at the meeting, following an extremely rocky 6 weeks of recent geopolitical history. On Wednesday, Biden also plans to present an international COVID-19 response plan. On Friday, leaders in the Pacific region will meet. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled that Russia is responsible for the 2016 killing of Alexander Litvinenko. The former Russian intel agent turned whistleblower/defector was killed by radiation poisoning linked to a cup of green tea. 2 Russian agents were found responsible. On the Russian side, there are still questions about the involvement of Mario Garamella, who some were alleging could have killed Litvinenko, and, not at the orders of the Russian government, which is what the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, has decided here. 40 officers in Sudan have been arrested today after a failed military coup d'etat attempt. The officers were arrested after attempting to take over the state broadcasters, television buildings, and the military general command. In tech news, the trial of the fraudulent tech founder Elizabeth Holmes is ongoing. This week, scientists formerly working for Theranos, the company she founded, are alleging that Holmes intimidated them into covering up evidence suggesting that the blood analysis technology she was developing and selling didn't actually work. She is on trial for fraud. In business news, Samuel Adams is launching a new limited edition beer. The quote-unquote Utopias brand contains 28% alcohol by volume, making it illegal in 15 states. Only 13,000 bottles will be made. The estimated price is $240 for a 25.4-ounce bottle. 28% alcohol is like way too much for a beer again. But with that, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The highest I can comfortably go is like 12 or 13%, and it's like quote-unquote comfortable. That's like pretty strong for a beer, but you get some Belgian doubles, triples, quadruples even. You get these ranges of flavors. It's delicious. I got into this for a little while, but 28% is like more than double what we were just talking about there.
That's pretty significant.
A lot.
I don't really drink like that. I always get alcohol. Well, I always bring alcohol back when I go on trips and stuff. But that stuff just sits there.
Yeah.
It's like, on some kind of weird special occasion, when family is over or something like that. It's like, hey, let's break open the Jägermeister from Germany or something. But yeah, that sounds pretty strong.
I drink a little bit too often, I'll be honest. I'm not like an alcoholic, but I have like a couple beers a night, most nights of the week, which is a little bit more than you should. And again, the main thing for me is like, it lowers the quality of sleep. It lowers testosterone. It's not like a big thing, but it's like I just know that physiologically my body would be in better shape if I didn't consume it, and instead I replaced it with like other de-stressing practices like meditation or weightlifting.
Or ecstasy or something like that.
Would you?
Yeah. No,
Maybe not that way.
I feel you. It's funny. In August, after I got sick that month, I think it was like I was very ill. Wasn't eating and everything else. I basically stopped any and all everything. Like there was no pot. There was no. There was other stuff like neurological stuff for gabapentin. I stopped everything. And so it's like for the last several months, I've just been this kind of clear mind thing going on. I haven't even had necessarily the impetus for it. Alcohol was never my thing, though. Like it was never the thing that I could never tolerate it, if that makes sense. Like it would always feel crummy. Always, these kind of secondary effects.
It is not one of the best drugs, I'll put it like that. But it has a deep history, not just in human history, but like animals get drunk kind of more often than you might suspect. That kind of thing. They like it, but no, it's not all that great a drug, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, it's not.
And I also stopped smoking.
Tobacco. That's another one. The tobacco also.
I stopped smoking tobacco. I also stopped smoking marijuana. I'd actually been vaping marijuana, but I stopped that.
Yeah.
All legal here in D.C., folks, by the way.
Yeah, all of the stuff is legal.
Transparency.
It's weird. I'm not even quite sure why. All of a sudden, it's just the all want of it just kind of stopped.
And so for me, alcohol became the thing where it's like, okay.
Oh, that's your replacement.
Exactly.
That's funny.
But that's not a good replacement. And so now I'm like, man, I should ease out of this. And so it's been a thing. We got calls, and I want to make sure we have time to get to them. We also have plenty to talk about in the headlines. But you know what? If you want to join the conversation, you can too. 202-521-1320 is the phone number.
We're going to bring somebody on to talk about the debt ceiling, but I do want to talk about it before we go because that's coming to a head today. The funding agreement, there are two things that are taking place right now. There is funding the government just improper, just, okay, we're passing a budget. And then there's the ceiling, debt ceiling. Back in, July, the ending of so there was a suspension of the debt limit going back like 2 years or more. And that ended in July. Mitch McConnell has basically said, I am not raising the debt limit. If the Democrats want to do it, they can do it for themselves. Now, what this means is that basically bills that were paid in this kind of bipartisan fashion, whether it was the COVID relief stuff, that stuff was basically agreed upon by both parties. Well, the Republicans and Mitch is basically saying, if you guys are going to pass your $3.5 trillion, you guys can handle it all, do it all yourself, which is going to create all sorts of problems because Democrats don't necessarily want to do that, even though technically they have the power to do it. And that's what's making this interesting. It's becoming this kind of political thing. Back when Donald Trump first took office, if you remember, Obama was going back and forth with Mitch McConnell. He eventually agreed upon a negotiation the first time around. The second time around, he refused to negotiate. They freaked out to some degree, but eventually the debt ceiling got passed. And from that point, there was no more negotiation on the issue of the debt ceiling. When Donald Trump took office, they raised the debt ceiling by $9 trillion. And there were several increases to the debt ceiling over the course of Donald Trump's presidency. Well, at this point, that has run its course. And now we're at this point now where the Treasury Department is basically saying, by the time we get into, I believe, November, we are going to basically run out of money. And that's not just from the debt ceiling part, that's also from the government basically shutting down. So all of this stuff is coming to a head. We often have this conversation about, the ability for government to function, just in general. Meaning, whatever a person wants to think about one way or the other, there's something unfortunate and gets across kind of an inability to just do basic things when a government can't just operate over the course of a period of time without continuously shutting down. And it seems that that's going to be our new politics. That basically every few months, either a shutdown because they don't necessarily want to extend the amount of money the budget is going to go, or in this case, potentially going over the edge. I don't think they're going to go over the edge. All things being equal, they're probably going to raise it through the reconciliation. But they don't want to do that. That looks bad optically, if that makes sense. Mitch McConnell and Republicans are going with this argument that, well, these guys are going to spend $3.5 trillion. They're going to do all of this stuff on their own, and they're going to raise the debt limit in order to do X, Y, Z all at once. And of course, Democrats don't necessarily want that optics, but they may not have a choice. They may get stuck with that optics anyway. I don't know, man. When we come across stuff like this, these kind of self-inflicted wounds of, whether it's COVID, whether it's the French deal. I mean, that's dependent upon how that works out, or whether it's self-inflicted or not, whether it's the Afghanistan thing. And now here's another thing that gets across an inability of leadership, or inability to just do basic competent things well, where the government potentially is going to shut down because they can't come up with an agreement to basically pay for itself.
Well, if you can't get anything done, at least you can stop your enemies from getting what they want done.
That's what it seems like.
That's the takeaway from this whole thing. And it can apply to the conversation, the debate over the debt ceiling. It can apply to any process in Congress. Yeah. Some would say that is the fundamental problem of democracy as such, is that when you have a bunch of people in a room and they can't agree on what to do and they stay a democracy, well, what do? They just keep each other from getting things done.
But it didn't used to be this way. I mean, the debt ceiling was something that they just understood that, okay, yeah, the government is going to make bills and we need to pay for the things that we basically used. And the Treasury Department needs the legal authority to basically say, yes, we'll cover this bill. That wasn't contentious at any point. I mean, like going back to the 60s, I mean, this wasn't something that was fought over. It was just kind of this, perfunctory thing. And all of a sudden it became this, just a very basic thing of paying for what you've already bought, or what you've already requisitioned.
I think because we've gone into a crazy amount of debt compared to what we used to be.
Like 28 trillion at this point?
Yeah, I remember back during the Occupy times, I was only so politically engaged, but I'd pull up there was a website in particular. It was like a chart of like the money where you could just watch the money grow. Yeah, they did some math and you could just see the numbers grow, and it was like faster than the mind could comprehend. How many Rolls Royces could every person buy with that money? I don't know the answer, of course, but the point is, the debt proper has become much more of a thing over the past couple of decades, right? And so conversations about the debt ceiling would apply. However, I do agree with you on the broad point, which is the filibustering thing, the keeping each other from getting anything done, because that's how you prove to your base that you're a real D/R, whatever, that you're real blue or real red. That's not good for America. It's not good for anybody here.
Keep in mind, though, they don't care about the debt like that. I mean, what was it? Dick Cheney was famous, deficits don't matter or something like that. Deficits do matter. But oftentimes that stuff doesn't really come up until it's used for political gamesmanship. They want to say Democrats are tax and spend, so they would use the tax and spend thing as a way of pointing to it.
I don't know if there's a they there. I know that a lot of libertarians, I don't think that
libertarians believe, yes.
Yeah, and a large part of, as we talk about, a large part of the Republican base is heavily influenced by libertarian thinking, and you can hear plenty of Republicans who are critical of attempts to push more money. They will justify it when it comes to things like war. Yeah. Some of them at least.
That's not my point.
Not Rand Paul.
Yeah.
But
Rand Paul is always, he's a true believer.
He's a true believer for sure. We got callers though. And I mentioned that we would get to him, and I don't want to delay on it too long. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. By the way, we have this next segment from now until 9:30 open. Then Michelle Woody's joining us for 15. And we're taking calls at the end of the show. Let us go now to Michael calling in from Silver Spring. I believe you're first up, Michael. What's on your mind?
Hi, I'm calling about this coronavirus situation. Everything that I hear since the beginning it's not really news to me. And then from the mainstream media, what they report, it's like entertainment, me seeing them miss the cue, because from the beginning, the coronavirus didn't make sense. No matter what side you're on, we can all agree that none of us had our heads wrapped around it. And it's just like all the news is coming out. It's just like, it's not news to me. It's just like, if you want to solve the problem, then you have to solve the problem by saying whatever the solution is, but by delaying it, and it's just propelling the problem into the future. Like the doctor said, he doesn't see the coronavirus cases going to zero. This coronavirus people started buying toilet tissue when there was less than 100 deaths in America. So it doesn't make sense. And that's all I have to say about it. It's just entertainment. I feel sorry for the families, but the reality is that we all can agree that we don't really know, like, what's the difference between, like, what does the coronavirus cell look like? That would help. What does it look like? Can you show us that?
I'm pretty sure they have shown that one before, but it's like you're sort of questioning everything, which is natural in these times when everything is falling apart and the old narratives are breaking. But I don't know. I'm not that universally skeptical. I buy that there is a thing there. I know people who've died from it, and I know people personally who've gotten sick with it. And
also, I've seen video of coronavirus cells flood a cell population. If I'm not mistaken, it was a brain thing where they were showing an example of how prolific it is. But I got to be honest, I don't necessarily know the value of a layperson seeing a coronavirus cell in context to the number of people that have dropped dead from it. I accept it as a real thing.
I accept it as a real thing, too. Mike, we got other callers. Michael from Silver Spring, thank you for the call. Let's go now to Tarif from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's on your mind this morning?
I have 3 quick comments. First, I'd like to say free journal science, free Dang Zerger, and hands off Haiti. My first comment is dealing with Evergrande.
Evergrande, yeah, the Chinese big real estate investment company. We were talking about that yesterday briefly with Mark Frost, but Tarif, what were you saying?
All right, yeah. Well, since y'all already brought it up, I just skip over that one and go straight to
No. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Huh?
I didn't mean to preempt you there, Tarif. What were you going to say?
And the $300 billion in debt. They're looking for a bailout from the Chinese government, but the Chinese government want to come off as like the U.S. government is trying to bail out a group of real estate people that basically over leverage the assets with those ghost towns that they built that was so expensive to 25% over that the average Chinese citizen couldn't afford. So now they're in debt to $310 billion in debt. They owe 128 banks. BlackRock invested in them. And, so they hoping and praying that they be saved by Xi, because you have Chinese citizens got the investments, the savings tied up into that the second largest real estate firm in China. All right.
My sense, Tarif, is that Xi will not go along with that. That Xi Jinping is not going to, and the CCP in general is not going to fall on the side of Evergrande. That a lot of people were defrauded effectively. That this is not good business practice, and that they are the kind of country, the kind of administration that will just simply crack down on it. That's at least what I've been hearing. That makes sense to me. But Tarif, what do you think?
A lot of people got their savings tied up into it, and they employ anyone from 1.3 to 4 million people. They have employment with. So we'll see what Xi and the Communist government is going to do. So we'll see. It's up in the air right now. But I'm going to move a guy. That's a far. I'm going to take that because I really don't know.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm more inclined to agree with Shane on this, that China is probably going to be far more punitive than we were during, the financial crisis in the United States. I don't necessarily get the feeling that they're just going to let that ride. But yeah, you're right. I mean, this is going to be a wait and see thing. Anything else, Tarif?
Yeah. Yeah, I have 2 more comments if y'all don't mind.
Go for it.
Victor Gao was on Australian TV yesterday, 13 hours ago, which is, Australian time. Well, he was talking about Australia would not be a nuclear safe zone anymore. Basically, they would be targeted. And the newscaster was saying, well, who would target us, China? And Victor Gao, which is the China International Associates Studies, he run that program in China. He didn't say China would target him, but the newscaster was trying to say, are we going to be targeted for nuclear attack? I said, no, what I'm saying is y'all not protected by the nuclear-free zone anymore. So it went back and forth. And also, Australia's getting Tomahawk missiles as well to go along with the Navy. My last comment is dealing with CAR T-cells that China been working on for some years, that the technology they got from the U.S. and Europe to fight cancer cells. There's $100,000 to treat someone with those cells in China, but it's $300,000 in the West. But 7 companies is working on the CAR T-cells to treat cancer, and over time the price is going to go down.
Chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy. I'm seeing articles about this from earlier this year. I hadn't heard about this one. Thanks for the lead on this. We'll look into this, Tarif. Appreciate it. That was Tarif from New Orleans. Thank you for the call. Let's go now to Michael, calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yeah. Hey, guys. Just firstly, I'm in Australia, as you know.
There were some protests here today just around coronavirus and the lockdowns. On Guangzhou Evergrande, I sort of know somebody I sort of know somebody, and basically I believe Guangzhou Evergrande will be nationalised and spun off into different sectors such as commercial, residential, in terms of the agency itself, the real estate agency itself, and it'll basically be nationalised and spun off over a period of time. It will be bailed out because there are about 3 million to 4 million employees who are actually encouraged by management to buy shares in the business, which have a large amount of family members and family members attached who also invest in the business. So the Chinese government doesn't like this unrest like all governments.
Yep.
So they won't be left out of pocket. They will be bailed out in some form. It may not be the form the West expects, such as like you still own the company, blah, 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 blah. But it will be dealt with, and it will be dealt with in-house, and there'll be a resolution brought to it. In terms of the nuclear sub-deal, Australia has made itself a bright flashing target now in South Asia or South Pacific. China will target Australia, I believe. Unfortunately, France has every right to be angry. Actually, the European Union came out today and said they're very angry too because their members being treated basically like a dog. And they're very angry themselves, and they back France in the issue, and they're questioning their relationship with the US currently. The guy from Down Under, in other words, as I call him, Scott Morrison, he's currently in Washington. So yeah, he's currently over there. The guy from Down Under, Powell, Mr. Prime Minister, all three times couldn't remember his name. He's currently in Washington. And France is very angry because they actually make nuclear submarines, and they would have amended their deal to make nuclear submarines instead of traditional submarines.
Michael, what's the media talking about in Australia on this issue? Because you're right. I mean, as we were mentioning earlier, it's very weird. I mean, ultimately, France makes nuclear submarines, and they were making conventional submarines explicitly because Australia apparently wanted conventional submarines.
They had to design them for them.
Yeah. I mean, it's very weird stuff.
And then, of course, Australia ultimately pivots to buy nuclear submarines from the U.S.
Right.
So they go to like France, which would, be like experts at developing nuclear submarines. Yeah, Jamarl, I didn't mean to take it away too far.
No. I mean, you're perfectly fine. I mean, to go back over it. I mean, basically, they say we want conventional submarines. France has to actually do that because France typically only sells nuclear submarines. And then they go back to the U.S. and they basically say, well, we didn't want the conventional submarines. We wanted nuclear submarines. And so the United States was offering us nuclear submarines, missing the fact that that's what France provides anyway. It's just very weird stuff. What's the media in Australia talking about in relation to this? I mean, how are they covering the story?
If you watch our ABC, which is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is state media, state-owned media, they have nuclear submarines sailing off into a red ocean with a red sunset, and they're saying it's not targeted at China. You have the head of the EU, Christine Lagarde. Not Christine Lagarde. You have the current head, the German lady who's now currently head of the EU.
I believe Ursula von der Leyen.
Yes, von der Leyen. And basically we're in the middle of a negotiation with a free trade agreement with the EU. And they're saying this will affect the negotiation with the EU. The opposition's coming out and saying, well, Europe's a major ally. The whole of Europe's actually a bigger trading partner than the US. So we trade more with Europe than we do with the US. At the same time, China's cutting its trade deal. China's basically cutting back on steel imports, of iron ore and stuff like that. So Australia's in a very precarious position at the moment where it's basically been drawn into an Anglo sort of alliance with the English-speaking countries. New Zealand has said basically Australian submarines aren't welcome, or the Australian Navy isn't welcome in New Zealand anymore because they've gone to New Zealand. As you know, New Zealand has a very strong stance against nuclear submarines and nuclear in general, and they're one of the Five Eyes. It looks as though Canada and New Zealand have been split off from the Five Eyes, and it's now just the three blind mice.
Very interesting. Michael, calling in from Sydney. We're going to be going into a break. Michael, appreciate it. You're our Australian caller. I don't mean to put you into a box, but I think you see it yourself, of course. And it's good to have these check-ins, especially with a story like this. Good to hear from you on the ground with this one. We're going into our break. When we come back, we'll be speaking with Michelle Whitty about the UN General Assembly starting last night, really starting in full force today, going on throughout the week. Biden due to speak later today. and then due to speak again on an international COVID response planned by the White House, apparently. That'll be coming tomorrow. We'll be talking about what's going on throughout the week following recent weeks of constant rocky footing for America's empire, for America's geopolitical standing. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Whitty. We are joined by Michelle Whitty, Sputnik News analyst and co-host of Political Misfits. She's here in the studio with us, and you can check out Political Misfits every Monday through Friday here on Radio Sputnik. That's from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern. Also, follow Michelle on the Political Misfits Twitter at Sputnik Misfits. That's twitter.com/Sputnik Misfits. Although, I don't feel like you guys, in terms of the Sputnik family, you guys don't feel like misfits to me. I just don't want you to feel left out in the cold.
Thank you so much. We feel we're not misfits here. Out in the streets is a different matter. But
maybe we're all misfits in that sense. In fact, exactly. I can sign on to that one.
Exactly.
Let's get into it. All right, we're talking about the UN General Assembly. Started last night with an appearance by the K-pop band BTS.
Yeah, man. When I went to look at I was like, let's just type in UNGA hashtag into Twitter, see what's going on. And it was 100% BTS.
I believe it.
Absolutely. Wow. Nothing but BTS. But nothing really started. Antonio Guterres is speaking right now. Joe Biden is going to speak at 10. So it's really just sort of kicking off today. Maybe we'll get some non-K-pop news in a few minutes.
You've been looking at it throughout the morning. What are people speculating Biden's going to talk about? What do you personally think he's going to have to say broadly when he starts speaking?
I mean, I don't know what he's going to say. I know what people are, the headlines are all, Biden wants to open a new chapter, but will he be able to? Is Biden's got to repair relationships? And so it is, I think, interesting about some of the coverage of it is that it is taken as a given that Biden wants to repair these relationships, right? So that it doesn't matter that Biden sort of blindsided France with this deal with Australia for these nuclear subs. It doesn't matter that Biden, there's a line in the Washington Post or the New York Times, I think, in an article about this saying, like, despite his efforts to distribute the vaccine throughout the world, there still is a huge gap. And it's like, you're really trying to tell me that Biden's been working hard to get this vaccine to the rest of the world? I mean, yes, the U.S. has done a little bit, but where I don't see these TRIPS waivers happening yet. I don't see the intellectual property rights being waived. So he's getting a lot of credit for what he apparently wants to do. And I think that that's interesting, especially when you look at his behavior on, say, immigration, which is something that he campaigned really heavily on a change in rhetoric, but also a change in policy. And we want to create pathways to citizenship and all that stuff. And he's just been remarkably, the continuity between the two administrations on that issue has been outstanding. And, I think that we are coming to a point where he might have said these things during the campaign. He might have campaigned very specifically against this sort of America First idea, but that isn't necessarily the way he's behaving. And so how long are we going to continue with this line that, well, Biden really wants X. It's just that he's doing all these other things because he has to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying trying to say that like, I don't think Biden wants to be in fights with European allies. I don't think Biden necessarily wants, acrimony in some of these serious relationships. But also, I don't know, Paul, action talks, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's a lot of pessimism also about climate. A lot of warnings that the COP26 conference, which is happening in Glasgow at the beginning of November, is going to be a failure if they can't, get people to commit to more serious, commit more, fully with more, with consequences for failing to meet these commitments and to more serious goals. And so, yeah, it seems like a pretty pessimistic UNGA, really.
It's interesting. Looking at China's vaccination plan, apparently there's 1.4 billion, vaccinating 40% of the country's nearly 1.4 billion people by the month. And giving out hundreds, at this point, millions of doses around the world. I mean, they've seemed to have taken concerted effort to get those out.
But those don't count. Did you see recently I cannot remember now what country it is, but they were like, if you were vaccinated, if you got the Sinovac, if you got a vaccine that was made in Cuba, if you got a vaccine that was made, I think, in South Africa, basically, if you got a vaccine that was not made in the United States or Europe, it doesn't count.
Like for travel purposes, that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
That's, wow, that is shocking.
Yeah.
As if the science somehow is different because it's coming out of China or somewhere else. That is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, this goes back to the malign actress thing. I think it was Bolsonaro for Brazil. They put in the document, in the Health and Human Services document, that China and Russia were engaging in vaccine diplomacy because they were giving the vaccine away, saying that this is their way to ingratiate themselves into these, calling them malign actors. And 66 million doses donated, 831 million doses delivered, and 1.24 billion doses that's to be sold.
So, I mean, the idea is that Biden's going to come up into this UNGA after Guterres sort of starts the morning saying, really like plaintively, we have to prove to our children that there's a point. There's a point to keeping on living, like that we have a plan and that the world's not going to just be a fireball before they get to be 50 years old. And I think, the expectation is that Biden is going to come out and say a whole bunch of things about how the U.S.'s alliances are so important to them. And we need, and also, we need to act together against the particular, the malign actors of the day. Russia, probably not so much. China, probably very definitely. And, talk about the United States as a beacon of democracy and, human rights and whatever.
But how does that fit into the context of everything that's taking place now? I mean, the Afghanistan thing made a lot of people angry. I mean, whether it was Germany, whether it was France, many of the European allies considered it a betrayal. And then immediately, I mean, at one point, Biden wasn't even taking Boris Johnson's phone call, which is astonishing when you think about it. And then you have Macron and France that is, incandescent, I think was the word that Peter Oliver used the other day. And that's not just France. France is one of the major countries in Europe at this point, which means that this is basically a European issue, not just a French issue. Biden is basically giving the speech in the context of basic disasters in regards to the world community. And this is not something they can put on Trump. I think Shane made the point earlier today that, there was a low bar with Trump. Biden was supposed to be the one that brings back internationalism and the adults in the room. How is that going to, I guess the question I'm asking is, what are the standards? What is the expectation of the speech needs to be, as opposed to what it's going to be, if there's the difference in those things?
Yeah, I don't know, because I don't know how much I don't know how much.
Like maybe the question is, what does he need to do in this speech to make the speech effective, as opposed to however the speech ends up going out?
That's a hard one.
What notes does he have to hit? Yeah, that's not easy.
I don't know. I mean, I guess the question is what's effective, right? Because I don't know that, certainly I don't think that people in power, we're talking about addressing the UNGA, right? So he's not like addressing a room full of like Washington Post stenographers or whatever, right? So I don't know that you can say anything that is going to undo the actions the administration has taken. And a lot of those are not actions I disagree with. You know what I mean? I don't wish that Biden hadn't pulled out of Afghanistan. You know what I mean? Like, I would be nice for him to come out and forcefully defend that decision, because I think it was the right one. I don't, I don't know really how much world leaders are placated by words when they don't match actions. So, I mean, I guess the question is who is Biden speaking to, right? And here he is speaking to world leaders. So I don't know. Maybe he's going to come out and make some new promises with regard to U.S. engagement with Europe, right? That might be a thing that would actually seem to have some teeth. Maybe he's going to come out and make some big promises with regard to COP26 and climate change deals. Undoubtedly, he's going to come out and try to make the case for why you should sort of choose the U.S. over China. Who knows? Maybe he's going to try and use Australia as an. I don't know this is going to happen in this speech, but maybe say like, look, big important countries are still sort of banking on the United States over China and our power in the Pacific. So like, you don't take my word for it. You can take Australia's word for it. I don't know.
But like you were setting up, that's all going to be kind of moot because I mean, Australia for like a half second, I was like, there's kind of a case there until I remembered France, which is, I would argue France, maybe not regionally a bigger ally. Clearly in the contest with China, Australia's proximate. It's right there. But France, one of the larger military powers in Europe, one of the largest arms exporters in the world, and one of the keystones of European diplomacy, inside the EU.
And a power in the South Pacific. I think we sort of ignore France's history.
Colonial history.
Yeah.
Totally. I wanted to do a brief check on this one. Sorry for cutting in. Just a brief check, though. Each show on this network is kind of, in some sense, its own universe. Different hosts, their own perspectives, they go off in their own ways, and then occasionally we'll make contact either by chatting briefly out in the main room there or by having each other on as guests. I don't know where you are at on this one. I know broadly where Jamarl and I are.
Go for it.
Between Afghanistan and last week's deal, how significant, what do you think those represent in terms of geopolitics, decades into the future, that kind of thing? Are those, like, we've been thinking of them as quite big events, but maybe we're overplaying them. What do you think?
No, I mean, I think it's a pretty big deal. I think it's a pretty big deal for Australia to do an about face in terms of its history of commitment to nuclear nonproliferation and to suddenly want a bunch of submarines. I do think sometimes because, we tend to scrutinize the U.S.'s sort of Cold War activities. I do think sometimes it's convenient to ignore that China has been steadily developing its Navy and building up its Navy. So like, I don't think necessarily we can ignore that. And nations do like to have the dude down the block has a whole bunch of ships. Like maybe you should also have a couple of ships. I don't think it's the greatest way to run things, but it is sort of the way of the world. But no, I do think that's a big deal, and I do think that France, as you say, is very upset. Yeah. I don't know that means that they can do much of anything unless they decide, okay, maybe the U.S.'s rival China is our partner for the future. That would be sort of, I don't know, but I do think that they were significant decisions. I think that France is justified in being mad about it. I think that China is justified in being angry about it. I think New Zealand's justified in, not allowing those ships into their ports, and I think that it does, if you're going to talk about a commitment to nonproliferation, I think that it makes it more of a joke, right? And, either Australia or the United States saying like, oh no, we don't want weapons sales to dominate the global economy. We're committed to nuclear nonproliferation. Yeah. But I mean, it was a joke to begin with, right? So it's an escalation of degree. I don't think it's a change in kind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, it does make sense. It's interesting because, like you say, it's unclear what France can do about it in the first place. Do you think this was more callous, or do you think it was? We were getting into this thing on whether or not this was a strategic pullback by the United States, basically to alienate France in this way, or if it was more so just they didn't care, meaning France can't do anything about it anyway. So
I don't know how much it's about. This is just sort of this is not a deep analysis, but I don't know how much this is about France rather than it is about Australia. Yeah. You remember when Obama announced the first pivot to Asia, the first thing that happened is that he sent 1,200 Marines to Darwin. So the first thing that happens when the U.S. begins to focus on the Pacific and on Asia is we, send more military personnel or hardware to Australia. Yeah. And that is going to be, Australia is going to be an important sort of forward operating base for the United States in the Pacific if we do actually intend to engage with, as the euphemism goes, with or try to further intimidate China. Yeah. So I think France is, I just think it didn't matter that much. Yeah. that deal. But the relationship with Australia really matters, and keeping Australia sweet with us really matters because, Australia and China have a very close relationship right now. It's the biggest trading partner in terms of imports and exports. And I think that perhaps there's a cultural component to it too. Like we want to make sure that China doesn't get too enmeshed with the West.
Well,
and
and
even though
there's
Australia geographically is way over there, we still consider it the West and in our sort of cultural sphere.
Yeah. There's also the Anglosphere. You brought up culture, and it just led immediately to mind. The shift, the Anglo-Bloc, Anglosphere. We used that phrase, I think, for the first time late last Friday. But I saw it making the rounds too. And I would argue is a more reasonable shift than referring to the international community ringed around the United States as like the West.
Yeah.
Which is how, the term that's been used, Western countries, developed countries, whatever. It's a much bigger shift. English-speaking countries, culturally, I can see that too. Michelle Whitty.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Absolutely.
Great talking.
We'll do it again. I'll be talking to you from Germany next week, I assume.
You will
Or Friday, yeah.
This Friday and then on Monday, too.
Excellent.
India
We'll
gave us
set
the
that
heads
up.
up.
So I
Exactly.
have a brat in one hand and, some analysis in the other, guys.
That should be great. You're going to enjoy that.
All right. Have a great one, Michelle. Thank you for joining us. Have a
Thanks.
great trip
See you
in
guys.
in
Bye.
Germany. Peace. Peace. All right. We're going to close this segment out. We will be coming back in a minute taking your calls. That was Michelle Whitty, for those listening, Sputnik News analyst, also co-host of Political Misfits. That's a show airing here on Sputnik every Monday through Friday from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern. Do go check them out. Also check them out on Twitter at Sputnik Misfits. And Michelle Whitty, again, thank you for being with us. When we come back, 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, that's 202-512-1320. We'll be back with you taking your calls on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. Fault lines.
202-521-1320 is the phone number. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We were in our last segment for the show today. Got about 10 minutes to take your calls. 202-512-1320. Justin Trudeau, by the way, has won re-election. Barely clinging on to power. This is after the blackface drop with another photo of Justin Trudeau in blackface at some old party popping up, but he managed to scrape through. Apparently that's not as big a deal in Canada as that would be in the United States. That would be, race relations as they are in the U.S. Yeah. That would be a real big thing. In Canada, I guess it's a little bit less so.
They give it a pass on some level. Yeah. Or opposition, it's like, because if you think about it, when Joe Biden was being accused by Tara Reid of the rape allegation, well, the question came up at that point, a comparison between whoever you were running against, and people were making some pretty rough arguments with Biden and Trump and everything else. It's very possible that there just wasn't opposition in a way that people could cling on to the opposition. But either way, he's ending up forming a minority government in Australia. I'm sorry, in Canada at this point. Not Australia. We've talked about it for so long,
Other Commonwealth nation.
Yeah, right.
The other one that's just to our north. No, just kidding. Also, breaking literally right now, I just saw this come in a minute ago from Sky News. Harry Dunn's parents. Remember Harry Dunn? Mm-hmm. The British kid who was killed. I believe he was riding a motorcycle or something like that. It might have been a bicycle, actually. I need to look back into it for just
an American diplomat or something,
yes.
or the wife of a diplomat hits him, drives him on the wrong side of the street. Yeah.
The wife of a diplomat received diplomatic immunity. And then, if I'm remembering correctly, it came out that she herself was like an intel asset who also had that. That hadn't come out at first. Anyway, apparently Harry Dunn's parents have reached some sort of settlement, some sort of resolution, quote unquote. Resolution is the right word. Mm-hmm. That's what's being quoted here. With Secoulis, it would be with the teenager's alleged killer in a claim over damages here.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine that. It's one thing to lose a parent. That's in and of itself rough, but there's no expectation that you're going to lose a kid. And especially when it's something like the person was driving on the wrong side of the street, or the person was some kind of asset, or even the claim of diplomatic immunity. Because it comes across as, wait a minute, this person did something they had no business doing, and now they're protected from it by some kind of, legal big leaf of sorts. I can imagine that is difficult, to put it mildly.
Especially a kid who gets so old. Although, quick reality check for the vast, vast, vast majority of human history, people have lost a lot of kids. Yes. That's, infant mortality rates is my only, I'm not trying to make a larger point than literally, in some sense we can get used to that stuff, but we shouldn't. And of course we're not at this point. And no, that is shocking. Any parent who has to go through that, I can only imagine what it's like.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially if, diplomatic immunity, you can't touch the person that did it. That's unfortunate. Have they went into any kind of details on what the deal was?
No, I just saw this came out, and I didn't want to, get too deep into it.
Mm-hmm.
Especially, a kind of a bunch of stuff going on. But also, again, actually, there are a couple of things that we said we were going to talk about headlines. Then we got into taking calls. I want to go back to a couple of these headlines in the last couple of minutes. 202-521-1320. Feel free to join in the conversation. Were you ever following the Elizabeth Holmes trial ongoing right now? But Theranos, this tech company that was making the waves a couple of years ago,
very vaguely,
very quickly fell. You don't remember too much about
very
this?
Vaguely, yeah.
Basically, and I want to get into this because it's interesting in a couple of ways. It'd be great to actually have a guest on to talk with about this one too. But basically, she developed this company that was selling this idea of a small piece of technology, like not a handheld device, but something that a CVS, a Walgreens, that kind of thing could have. For doing blood analysis on site. So I don't know the details, and it's been a while since I've looked into it, but basically the idea is, you have centrifuges, they're able to separate out material, and then you can do quick on-site analysis of what's going on, of the blood, of what's the various constituents of the blood, so that somebody can do a quick checkup. And it's faster, it's cheaper. Sounds great, right? The problem was it was basically all a pack of lies that she was using to defraud major investors. Now, there are a couple of interesting things about this case, and this is why I would like to get into it. For one thing, she is a woman, and it's simply true. For one thing, she is a woman, and a lot of the founders of tech companies are very notably men.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of the coverage of this one recently, even though for a while there, people were roundly critical of what she was doing, Ellen Powell, I believe, over at the Washington Post specifically, has started to, I've seen it, and other people have sort of been following suit or acting simultaneously in the same way. They're starting to soft pedal it, and they're almost trying to play her up as like a woman tech CEO coming under too much scrutiny simply because she's a woman. So that's just an interesting culture war, gendered component to it. Take that, put it, for whatever it's worth.
Right.
Part of why it's an interesting conversation. Number two, the investors that they were choosing to go after. So a lot of tech companies, you'd start out with a small seed idea, you develop it, you get seed investors who put in, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, but they push you, occasionally millions, but those are like that's the initial round. Then you go out, you do your work, whatever, you build up your product, you come back, you go to larger investors, they put in more money.
Yeah, you expand the business as it goes along. As you can show more
expand in stages, iteratively, that kind of thing. And you work up your way through larger investors, and it either works or it doesn't. And you either have a massive IPO and rake in the billions, literally billions of dollars in so many of these cases, or hundreds of millions if you're not doing so well, or it fails, and usually this just sets you up to go on and start another tech company, failures aside, whatever. That's not how Theranos worked. Theranos went through institutional investors. They went through like non-standard tech company investors, pitching them the idea, okay, you want to get in on one of these tech unicorns, one of these FANG companies. You want to get in on this? Well, here's your best shot. This is our technology.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, it turns out Elizabeth Holmes, this is coming out earlier this week, she's personally intimidating scientists on her staff into confirming the test results, basically getting them to tell everybody else, no, the technology works, it's great, even though the majority of the tests were coming back as failures.
Yeah.
That's what's going on this week. But it's just an interesting
story.
It touches on these different parts, whether it's gender or tech companies or simple big business fraud and people getting up to no good. And how it was a big thing for a while there.
Well, do they know if it started off as fraud? Meaning, was it fraud all the way through, or was it failure that eventually went into fraud? Does that make sense?
I would love to know what they know.
Yeah.
But, I only know so much.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. The Theranos, or the name Theranos, it sounds vaguely familiar, but I don't remember digging too far into the case.
It sounds a little bit spooky on its own, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's kind of, maybe it's the connection with Thanos. but it's got that kind of rhyming badness thing going on.
No, you're fine. You're fine. But it's very interesting. It says she's moved ahead with Walgreens rollout despite internal concerns. Yeah, I'm very curious. I was looking at the thing that Tariq mentioned too, the T-cell thing. It said 60 to 80% of the results ended up being positive in regards to dealing with cancer, basically using like killer T cells to go after some kind of treated immunological cells to go after cancer. That stuff is phenomenal. It's so interesting. Like it's the level of technology that we could potentially develop. I mean, we're just at the beginning stages of that stuff.
That's true.
Whether it's mRNA or whether it's the killer cell stuff.
The killer T cells. Great band name, by the way.
Killer T cells. Yeah, awesome band name.
Exactly.
So now it's very cool. I would be totally down to bring somebody on for the Theranos thing.
This is turning into our free-form meeting segment, apparently, where we're like, let's get this person, let's get this one. But interesting stories coming out this morning. You know what? I've like joked about it. I wrote in the thing with BTS about how they started it out. Pardon me. K-pop band BTS opened up the UN General Assembly last night.
Weird.
And in our headlines, I wrote, and no, I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
Because for me, I see that, and I hadn't known they would be performing. But like Michelle said, it's breaking all over the news, and last night, this morning.
Yeah.
Isn't that like idiocracy? I can't tell. This is like a Schrodinger's cat type of situation. On the one hand, that seems like idiocracy.
It's like, why do you have to dumb it down to that degree?
It's the UN General Assembly.
Yeah.
It's not like the Emmys.
Right.
It's the UN General Assembly. This is a major international event of long-lasting significance. And you have a K-pop band, BTS, who I hear is good, but whatever.
Yeah.
You have them performing. So that's on the one hand, idiocracy maybe. On the other hand, is it maybe good? Is this a way to get young people engaged? Is this a way to get people who might not otherwise pay attention to politics suddenly paying attention to politics? I can see both sides of it. What do you think, Jamarl?
I don't know. I'm falling on the side of idiocy. I mean, I don't necessarily think everything needs to be dumbed down to the lowest common denominator. It's a serious meeting of world leaders that are coming together to talk about serious topics. In the United States, 700,000 people have basically dropped dead from COVID. You have millions of people around the world. And, all sorts of issues, whether it's Afghanistan, issues of war, peace. Some of these world leaders are extremely corrupt and everything else. And to that severity of issues, K-pop band.
Yes.
It's like, well, how does this even fit into the context of this? Like, I mean, does everything require this kind of lowering of I don't know, of intellect or lowering of standards to kind of get the lowest common denominator? Also, is that something that people would watch? Meaning, does somebody who's into K-pop listen to the K-pop and stay for the speeches?
God, no. That's the thing, and that's why for me the second argument ultimately falls flat. Maybe that you can argue they're doing positive association. You're making them feel good things about geopolitics, and about the UN, which is whatever.
It just seems like it's dramatically different.
No, they just drop out. It's just a way to. I'm curious, but also worth pointing out, I think, South Korean cultural supremacy. And I don't mean that in any sort of negative way, but K-pop international success, watched by millions, hundreds of millions, billions, I would argue, the world around. Maybe not billions, but a lot of people the world around, including and specifically in the United States, where K-pop has become a bit of a thing in ways that you might not expect it to. So for South Korea, big cultural victory in its own small way.
Very interesting, but yeah, I didn't get that either. I was like, are they serious?
Yep.
I saw them running through the UN or something. Everything doesn't require this kind of lowering. Like you said, this is not the Emmys. This isn't a football game where you have a halftime show. These are all things being equal, serious people talking about serious things. I don't see how K-pop applies, but
I don't see how it applies exactly either. But hey, I get it. Maybe. Actually, I don't get it. We've got to close this show out. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be coming back tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Eastern, as we always do. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a great day. Signing off. See you on the other side.
have all of these separate ingredients. And working people just don't have it like that. And I think we just really need to stop, shaming people because they can't eat vegan and, quote unquote healthy. Look, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, it's like my mother just told like, well, get a blue box, like one of those things send it to you. I'm like, well, that's cool, but I still have to cook it. Like that's kind of the problem. I would still have to find some time to set aside.
Right.
To cook stuff.
Now, what I had started doing, which helped me and Abdus a lot, was I would cook for the whole week.
Yeah,
on
that
Sunday.
meal prep.
Yeah.
That's the best way to do it, really.
Yeah. But then, Mr. Lukman did not like leftovers after 2 days. So I'm just like, nigga, you're really making life difficult.
I hated leftovers too when I was a kid.
I don't understand that. I mean, it was delicious the first time, but I don't
know. I don't know. It's just completely reasonable. But then as you get older, I realize stuff. Especially like when you go off to college, you don't have like access to that quality of food all the time, like your mother's cooking.
We be in a fight. Like, what's for dinner? I made spaghetti Sunday. Come on, we had it last night. It was delicious yesterday. And it is even more delicious today.
Hello.
Hey, Derek, it's Sean and Jackie. How are you?
Hey, Sean and Jackie. How you guys doing?
Doing well, doing well. So glad that you could join in with us today.
Yeah.
We
Good
will
to join.
Absolutely. We will go ahead and get started. This piece should be about 15 minutes.
Okay.
Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jackie Lukman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And today we're talking about the life and ongoing influence of Paulo Freire, and we're very happy to be joined for this conversation by Derek Ford, Assistant Professor of Education Studies at DePaul University and the Deputy Editor of the Journal for Critical Education Policy Studies. Derek, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And Derek, we recently marked the 100th birthday
of Brazilian Marxist educator and theorist Paulo Freire, perhaps best known for his seminal work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is a work that I think is popular amongst some circles, although I think oftentimes taken out of context and really separated from the politics of a Paulo Freire. I was introduced to the book myself when I was an undergrad, and, you know, I thought it was interesting in the broadest sense, but without sort of having a deeper understanding of sort of the framework that Freire was coming from, I think we really sort of lose something. But just to circle all the way back, I was hoping you could begin by telling us just who was Paulo Freire, and from your perspective, what was he trying to accomplish with Pedagogy of the Oppressed?
For sure. Yeah. So Freire was born, 100 years ago, September 20th, 1921, in Brazil to a working class family that was impacted greatly, as so many were, by the Great Depression of the 1930s. And so, you know, spent many of his years in childhood in hunger and, you know, sort of delinquent conditions. And as a result, fell behind several grades in schooling. And eventually, though, went and studied law and studied philosophy and language and so on and so forth, and became involved in government ministries as well as university administrations. And it was there that he really, you know, set to work developing literacy programs and particular pedagogies that would accompany them that were, you know, wildly successful and, you know, resulted in, you know, so many peasants being able to read and write. And this was really important because at the time in Brazil, in order to vote, you had to pass a literacy test. And so, you know, it's really motivated by enfranchising, you know, the poorest and the oppressed in Brazil. And, you know, it was so successful that it was really adopted on a large scale. And Freire would eventually go on to help other, you know, newly liberated nations, you know, develop and implement their own literacy programs. But in 1964, when the military junta, right-wing dictatorship, came to power in Brazil, they exiled Paulo Freire. And he ended up in Chile for several years, which is where he wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And then, you know, the book was translated into English. He ended up actually spending a couple of years at Harvard. And then he was in Geneva, Switzerland, working with sort of international agencies. He spent time with Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau. And really his work, you know, I mean, it was really one of the first specifically educational theories for the revolutionary struggle, and in particular, the Marxist struggle, although Freire was also a Catholic, and so it really heavily influenced liberation theology in Latin America. But you're right. I had the same experience actually in graduate school, getting my PhD in a fairly critical program where we only read the first 2 chapters of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And they're excellent, you know. They're where he really articulates his critique of, you know, what he calls banking education. He proposes another model of education that's more liberating. But we stopped reading before we got to his politics, which is basically why he wrote the book in the first place, right? And obviously there's reasons for that, because once you read, in particular, the 4th chapter, you see that his pedagogy, while it began, you know, as a method of teaching peasants how to read and write in a liberatory fashion, was basically extended in the book to a pedagogy for revolutionary struggles and, in particular, revolutionary organizations. And it's really not so much about teachers and students as it is about revolutionary leadership. Shit, sorry. Can we edit that out?
Yeah, sure. Shouldn't be a problem. And yeah, and I wanted to get deeper into that, Derek, from a I guess, ideological standpoint, because, and really get into sort of the substance of Freire's thought. And I was hoping you could explain just what is pedagogy? Like, what does that word mean? And what is the difference between the Marxist pedagogy of a Paulo Freire and the conventional kind of pedagogy that perhaps most of us are familiar with in our own experience in schooling?
Yeah, well, I'll say you're not the only one who's unsure about exactly what pedagogy is. And I usually distinguish it from curriculum, whereas curriculum refers to the content of what is taught. Pedagogy refers to the how and the relationships that we engage the curriculum in. And, you know, for Freire, his conception of really capitalist schooling was that it was all of the pedagogy was what he called the banking model of pedagogy, in which the students are viewed as basically empty receptacles, you know, like a new bank account that the teacher then deposits knowledge into, right? And what he found, not only that was disempowering, but that it actually made the students and the oppressed into objects for the teacher to, you know, to use and to mold. And so it deprived them of being subjects in their own right. And so in response, he develops a dialogic pedagogy in which the teachers and students, you know, the teacher still has a role, right? The teacher is still an authority of sorts. They can't relinquish that authority. The teacher still has politics and a sort of end goal in mind, but that the teachers and the students are engaged in a collaborative process of what he called naming the word and naming the world. So just to give an example, he might draw a picture, you know, on a whiteboard or something, and then everybody in the room will talk about what they see in the picture, and then he would guide them to basically a more deeper critical understanding. And through that process, they would name the situation, right? Exploitation or oppression or racism or, you know, something like that. And, you know, the words would come from the students themselves, right? Although the teacher had to guide and facilitate that process, right? And so I think that in a sense, the main distinction, not just with Freire, but with other Marxist educators, is that we begin by presuming that students are subjects in their own right and that they're competent and that we all have equal intellectual capacities, which doesn't mean that we all know the same things or the same amount of things, but that we all have the same capacities for knowledge and for action, right? And that's the other thing, of course, with Marxist pedagogy and Freire is that, of course, thinking is an action, right? It's a verb to think, but thinking that's disconnected from action, he called verbalism, right? And I think that's a way that a lot of his work is taken up today, is a sort of form of verbalism where it's sort of where it's used to critique capitalist schooling structures or neoliberal schooling structures by people who are really disconnected from the actual movements of the people. And so Marxist pedagogy is really premised upon the belief in the masses, you know, to make the world and to shape the world, and the political commitments to engage in those struggles.
Yeah, Don, and I feel like I have new insight into a quote from Paulo Freire, where he said, "Whoever teaches learns in the act of teaching, and whoever learns teaches in the act of learning." And this makes a lot more sense to me, you know, understanding the perspective that he wrote pedagogy from and what he was trying to achieve, trying to convey the idea that the masses are not just sitting there to be vessels for someone else's knowledge to be poured into. The process of learning, of being educated, I guess, is also empowering for them, and they are also becoming teachers in the process of learning. And I feel like this is why Freire's work is so dangerous. What, you know, to the point that it is being banned. Apparently, it's been banned. His book has been banned in Arizona.